oldlog.zip, and obviously because it works, I'm gonna ask that you guys leave a like if you enjoyed this video or at least thought it was interesting, because I'll probably never do this again unless people want to see it. So thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Alrighty, so first map we're playing today is one by Jaeger. I actually don't remember the name. I'm sorry, I'm the worst. But if you want to check out the map, the down's in the description of this video. It's a nice like beginner parkour. Of course I would fall right as that happens. So if you're not the best at parkour, this is a great way to start. We got a checkpoint system. That's really cool. All right, well that makes it easier. Although, oh wow, I guess I didn't make it to that checkpoint, huh? Oh wait, we're right by the fence. Okay, that's not as bad. So let's see. Hopefully we can make it through the whole map before this section ends. I only want to spend like, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes doing this parkour, and then we're going to switch over to some survival and see how well Calm Tyler can do. Because I really want to give you guys a taste of like how I used to record these videos. It was just very flow of conscious thought. I'm just talking to you. I'm just some dude, right? And I talk about what I'm doing here and there, but for the most part, just not super loud and everything else. And I like doing that now because it's like part of my job. I enjoy being able to be bouncy and fun. Not many people can say they like their job, you know what I mean? But I do. But we're gonna keep it the map for the video because that makes a lot more sense. This is what it'd be like if I was just another YouTuber and I wasn't trying to talk to you guys. So far we got a really good streak. Ouch, I've fallen again. Okay, well, I'm teasing a little bit, but you guys get the picture. We're gonna stay focused on the sandstone. All right. Ooh, we got a good streak there. Very good streak. Come on. Hopefully we can get this jump too. All right. Oh, and the stupid sound is annoying me. It's like throwing me off. Oh, there we go. Is this another 4 block? No, we're fine. Okay, good. I think we're going to be fine from this point. Yeah, we hit another checkpoint. Thank goodness for the checkpoints. Otherwise, this may have been a really different story. All right, up the ladders. So far, so good. There we go. And I think this is the final jump for this level. We're making pretty good time, to be honest. Come on. Again, thank goodness for the respawn point. That's hilarious. Now, I feel like lost. I think we're going, yeah, this is the right way to go because there's a 4 block there. Already back at the ladders. We haven't lost too much time. Do you guys really like, no, there's no way you guys like this version of Tyler more. Like, the other one's way more fun. I'm so much more fun in my videos now as opposed to this. This just feels like, I don't know, this feels boring to me. Some people call me cringe. You're cringe, man. You try doing this. Like, you're crazy. This is fun. It's nice to be calm, I guess, but like the whole reason I'm good at what I do is because like I genuinely, well, I hope that didn't sound arrogant. I feel like I'm good at what I do. You know, there's lots of people that do better, but you know, I feel like I do great. You know, with YouTube and everything. But the point is, oh, I forgot my point. Look at this. Oh, right. So the point is, I've been doing this for so long. You do it for long enough, you learn how to do it like efficiently. You know what I mean? And I found a nice, efficient way of doing it that lets me have fun. Although I really, really wish that there were more checkpoints on this map because I want to finish. There's only one more stage after this one. And I think we're going, yeah, we're going this way. Come on. I bet you the last level is nothing but stupid 4 block jumps. Watch, I would lose it. Okay. There we go. Well, at least we hit that one. At least we got some ladder jumps. Ladder jumps are usually easy. They're like my favorite types of jumps to do. Glad I caught that. Oh, glad I caught that too. Holy moly, that was close. Oh boy. All right, so let me see. Try my best to like be old Tyler. It's so hard to be old Tyler because you're constantly changing, right? You're always transforming as a person. It's hard for me to go back to, oop, oh wow, okay, there's barrier blocks. It's hard for me to turn into an old person because that's just the person you were. Like now I'm a new person in some ways, you know what I mean? Like, oh, it's weird to even think about. Yeah, of course, it's all 4 blocks. Come on, like we had a chance of beating this in the next minute, but now that it's all 4 blocks, this might be a different story. We might have a different story to tell. I think we're so far. I might just cut out when I fall and stuff, even if it takes a little bit, of the nostalgia away. Like, come on, like I want to complete this. You see, yeah. All right, we're gonna try one more time. Please. You know what's funny? I just realized a big part of the reason I'm different now is because when I started making my videos years and years ago, I used to live at home with my parents. Here's a checkpoint. Thank goodness. I used to live at home with my parents, and like I was like embarrassed to like be loud and have fun in the videos because they could hear me. And my little sister, she was only like 9 years old at the time, and like YouTube was a different place, and like I told my parents like, hey, this would be awesome if this was my job. It wasn't as common for it to be people's jobs at the time, right? So it was just a different environment, and like I was really quiet because I had to be, because I lived at home. Now I live on my own, and I can be loud as I want, and that's awesome. But before, I used to have to be quiet. And honestly, I feel like that's the same for a lot of young people that do YouTube. Like, you could probably do a lot more and have a lot more fun if you didn't have to worry about what mom and dad thought. You know what I mean? Well, maybe one day. For now, we finished the parkour. We're gonna take things over to some survival style, old-fashioned log.zip. I'm not looking forward to it. Wait, don't go. I was just kidding. It's gonna be fantastic. Here we are in a survival world, and we're gonna see how far we can get into a cave system. Maybe try and find diamonds within like the next, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. You know, the map was a nice little taster, but this is like the real deal. This is survival Minecraft. This is something like I hardly even play anymore. Yes, I'm gonna get a whole bunch of comments. TTB, Tempest Box. Guys, I got... here's the thing. I don't really talk about my plans anymore. I feel like when you talk about plans, it jinxes them sometimes. I got plans for survival. Do they involve TTB? They do involve TTB, but we need to wait for certain things to like be completed and like ready to go, and no bugs and things like that. We need to have a proper team assembled. We're gonna do something cool, but I don't want to give you any details because you curse yourself when you do details. You know, you start telling people too much and it starts to put like a pressure on you. It's important to have goals and to, you know, meet those goals, but you don't need to tell people about them all the time. There's some life advice from log.zip, and you know, maybe you don't agree with that, and that's okay too. I didn't ask you. But anyways, I think we probably got enough wood. I wasn't even really paying attention. We got a whole bunch here. Yeah, it's been so long since I've done survival Minecraft. I really enjoy it. It's just there's like almost 10 years worth of Minecraft survival videos on YouTube now. If you want to go watch a survival series, you've got plenty of options right now. Like, and I'm not trying to get you to leave the video or anything, but it's the truth. Like, survival's been so done. Everyone's done survival. Now, I want to do survival when I can do it in a way that makes it different. So that's why we have things like TTB, and we're looking at the Quark mod, and we're looking at all these things. Ooh, remember this guy? He would make appearances too. Yeah, we got plans for things like that too, but it all comes step at a time now. For now, though, I'm going to keep getting some food, and we're going to try and get our way into a cave. Okay, we have a pretty good amount of everything we could need. I think we just got to find some coal now. I got a cave right here. Okay, wow, well, I didn't know it went this far. I don't see any... Oh, there's some coal, thank goodness. It's near the front, right? Okay, so I'm going to mine this up. There we go. I will take you. Thank you very much. It is very dark right here, like out of nowhere, and that looks like it actually goes really far. So look like we found a good cave system too. Let's see, we got anything down here worth maybe? Oh, we got iron. Okay, well, I won't go too far, and we got some cobblestone that we can use to tower, or to get back up, I should say. Guess we can offhand that. That's fine. What else we got? Is that a... Oh wow! Hey, look at this! Oh wow! You gotta be joking me. Hold on. Oh, holy moly. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, he came out of nowhere. Holy moly. Okay, well, we got some easy swords at least. Yes, this works out perfectly. Hold on a second. I guess I should mine the rest of this while it's nearby. How does that happen? I had no idea. Actually, it goes down another way. I wonder if there's something on the other side, too. I gotta get the rest of this. Did I get... Okay, we'll leave the torches there because I don't want any monsters to spawn. Okay. I'll grab you. Yikes. Well, I'm glad we got some food. Actually, we don't have any cooked food yet either. I'm not that good at this Minecraft game, huh? It's been a little bit since the last survival experience. Hey, okay. Oh, wow. And we got a ravine. And more mine shaft. Wow. Yo, this is a really good seed. I'll make a trade. If y'all want the seed, You gotta leave a like right now. I want to see 5,000 likes, and I'll leave. I know, isn't that terrible? Yo, I remember like back in 2013, I remember asking for like 600 likes. That's like 4 years ago now. I know we can do that. So if y'all want the seed, I'm not gonna compromise on that. So did I just see diamond? I thought I just saw diamond for a second. I was gonna lose my mind. Okay, hold on. There's a witch somewhere. Oh man, I heard him. Okay, we need to. I'm gonna turn this into armor. Actually, I need a chest plate. That's probably the best thing we can do. I can deal with the rest of the. And you know what? Yeah. I'm gonna mine some stuff up. Hold on. I just realized I have no coal, so now I gotta come back up. And thinking about it, I should just go down the mine shaft way. It's probably a lot safer, and there's probably more chests that way too. Oh yeah, I think we're gonna do that. All right, things are really cooking now. We got 2 furnaces. I'm gonna go ahead and we got the perfect amount of iron for a sword and a shield. I think this is how you make a shield. Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. So we got the shield. That's all handled. Sword ready to go. We got 1 iron chest plate. I'm back at the stupid this area, but I figured, hey, let's just go hard. You know, that's the whole point. Like, this is 1 episode long. I don't really need to start making an LP here. We're just trying to get some diamonds real quick. You know what I mean? And we're already at 5 minutes. I want to see if we can do it in less than 10 minutes. Wouldn't that be great? That would be great. All right. Ooh, okay. So anyways, I think if we just... I just don't want to run into that witch. That witch is somewhere, and if it's the reason I die, I'll be so upset, truly. And I might organize. Okay, something's nearby. I just heard something moving around. Don't know what it was. Oh man, there's actually a whole bunch of mobs around here. I don't feel safe. Here's what we're gonna do. There we go. Now they won't be able to reach me. Okay, that works out perfectly. Okay, much better. This is looking real tight. Now we're gonna make our way down as best we can, and hopefully nothing grabs us. I don't even remember how much I used to cut out before. I know I used to cut video even back years ago. I just don't remember how much of it I was doing. I do a lot of it now because I just think it's boring. You don't want to watch me walk around. I'm telling you, if the witch... Oh, I don't know what I'd do. What would I do? The witch has got to be around. Maybe it can. Will shields help me? Wait, where is this witch? Like, I need to like hold this now just in case. We're just gonna fall in because I have no idea. Oh boy. Okay. I don't know where the witch is. Okay, but the witch is close. The witch might know where I am. Okay, good. We can still use the shield. Where is it? This is so scary to me right now.
In hindsight, this whole thing might sound a little bizarre to most people, maybe even a little comical. But believe me when I tell you that, at the time, it was the scariest thing I'd ever experienced. Before I begin, a little backstory. I'm an American that used to live in China, despite the fact I couldn't speak or understand more than a few words in Mandarin. I was living with my girlfriend out there at the time, and needed to find a way to make some cash. Seeing as my vocabulary was limited to "where's the bathroom" and "I'll have another beer please," I figured I was shit out of luck. In the end though, a friend of mine out there managed to bag me a pretty sweet gig. In China, they have a lot of Western knockoffs. iPhone clones, designer clothing rip-offs, stolen car designs, etc. They're all made way cheaper, and it usually shows. But this sort of stuff is everywhere. The place where my friend landed me a job was actually a counterfeit version of Disneyland, a small theme park that was catering to the ever-growing middle class in China. It didn't go by the name Disneyland, of course, but the whole magical aesthetic had been borrowed, so to speak. In fact, the only real difference was that everything was a lot scruffier and cheaper looking. They had people in circle-eared mouse costumes parading around the park, a guy who dressed up as a duck in a sailor's outfit, and I swear one of the entertainers was literally just Buzz Lightyear. They gave them different names to their American counterparts. For example, Crazy Mouse instead of Mickey Mouse, but you get the point. The whole thing was really shameless, but at that point in time, a job was a job. And my job was to dress up as one of these characters and entertain the kids. The character I was set to play was a tall dog with long, black, floppy ears, a yellow jacket, and a tiny hat. Yup, I was literally bootleg Goofy. The kids seemed to know the character well enough, and would always come running up to me, shouting the character's Chinese name. It didn't matter to them that the costume I was wearing was tattered and discolored. To them, this place was still magical. Thankfully, none of the costumed performers were allowed to talk to the visitors. We could only communicate through gestures. As such, my lack of Chinese wasn't so much of a problem. I was also lucky in a sense that Goofy's known for being quite dumb, so when I didn't react properly to whatever one of the kids said, it didn't seem so out of character. I was working the night shift at the park at the time. There was a special event going on to celebrate the upcoming New Year, and we were staying open a lot later than usual to build up buzz and put on some late night shows and attractions. I was doing my usual thing, namely waddling around the park, boiling to death in my Goofy suit prison, and trying to put a smile on all the kids' faces by being stupid. This might sound like an easy job to you guys, and in terms of being mentally challenging, you'd be right. Physically though, it could get a little rough at times. The sun might have gone down that night, but it was particularly hot. Seriously, it felt like I was 6 inches from the sun inside that damn suit. I had to take a break, so I made my way to a nearby rec room, one of the few spots in the park where we're authorized to take off our costumes. I get inside and immediately take off my giant character head. As I'm sitting there, relaxing, another one of my co-workers enters the room. They're in their costume, but immediately I know who it is because of the outfit they're wearing. It's a guy I called Sean. There was only one costume for each character at the park to avoid the kids ever spotting two of the same guy next to each other. That sort of thing ruins the illusion. Sean was hired to play this giant, anthropomorphic orange cat with a big grin plastered on its face. I have no idea who this character was supposed to be. Maybe one of the park's own creations. There he was, just standing in the rec room doorway in all his feline glory. He was one of the few co-workers I had that spoke good English. I looked up at him and said, "Hey, how's the night going?" He doesn't respond to me. In fact, he doesn't really move at all. He's just standing motionless in the doorway, looking right at me through the eye holes of his costume. "You not hot in there, buddy? You can take your head off." Things go uncomfortably silent. All I can hear are these heavy breaths coming from inside Sean's suit. The kind of breathing you hear from people in a deep rage or something. "Sean, you okay in there?" I ask him. That's when I notice it. In his gloved hands, he's holding something. It's a hammer. I'm starting to feel a little worried now, nervous about what's going on inside this guy's head. He bursts out into this verbal tirade in Chinese. I could only understand a few of the words, but one of them stood out. Lauwai. Foreigner. He's pointing the hammer at me as he's speaking. Whatever he's saying, he's furious. All I'm thinking about is how to defend myself against this guy if he comes at me swinging. Step by step, he's inching closer, waving the hammer about like a fanatic. I can't get past him through the main door. My only other option is the door to the hallway behind me. It leads to another room which has access to the outside. Problem was, half the time the door was locked. If there wasn't another member of staff in there already, I'd be running into a dead end. If that was the case, then I'd be screwed. I decided to take my chances. What other choice did I have? I leapt up from my seat and made for the hallway. Sprinting down it, I could hear Sean's footsteps behind me. He was screaming in Chinese, though I couldn't tell you what. All I can tell is that he's hot on my heels. As I reach for the handle to the potentially locked door, I say a small prayer to myself. Please God, let this thing be open. I twist the handle, and the door gives way. There was indeed someone else in the room. I have no idea who he was, and he didn't seem to understand me as I tried to explain in English what was going on. Holding the door closed proved to be pointless. Sean slammed his way into the room, still holding the hammer. I made like a madman for the exit, hoping to lose him in the crowd of the park. I could hear the other employee trying to calm him down in Chinese. At least, that's what I assume he was doing. Thankfully, as I made my way through the park, the guy didn't pursue me any further. I informed my superior, and an investigation began. A few things came to light after that. Firstly, Sean wasn't working at the park that night. He wasn't even in the province. He'd gone back to see his family for New Year celebrations. The suits are left in lockers at the park, so whoever was wearing the costume had somehow got access to staff quarters and very deliberately made a point to target me personally. It also turned out that one of the on-site constructors had a hammer missing from his toolkit. This whole thing had been planned out. The other park worker who tried to calm the attacker down wasn't so successful. He ended up with a broken wrist after struggling with the guy for the hammer. Sadly, nothing ever came of the case. I guess the whole thing just sounded too ridiculous to take seriously. Besides, the cops weren't interested in hunting down some random guy that threatened a Lauwai at a theme park. Ultimately, I'll never learn who was behind the mask, or why the hell they tried to threaten me. Nor will I know if they planned to take things further had my coworker not been in that room. I ended up losing my job for running headless through the park. That didn't matter. I was gonna quit anyway. Despite the whole magical facade going on there, I no longer felt welcome. Not being able to find any other work, I ended up breaking things off with my girlfriend and moving back to the States. I'm now married with 2 young children, and they both keep asking to go to Disneyland. If I see a guy in a goofy suit walking around over there, I'll be sure to shake his giant, gloved hand. Those guys don't get enough credit. I was spending a long weekend with my family in this log cabin. Nobody else around for miles. It was late afternoon, and I decided to go for a walk by myself through the woods. About 10 minutes in, something starts to feel a little off. I realize that it's because of the sound, or more specifically, the lack of it. The woods had become dead silent. No bird chirps, rustlings, or general nature noises at all. Just pure, unnatural silence. Anyone who spends a lot of time outdoors will tell you that a quiet forest is a dangerous forest. I hear someone approaching from in front of me. When he comes into view, I see that it's a lone man in his 50s. As we come to pass each other, I get a close look at him. He's got thinning, grey hair, deep wrinkles across his forehead, piercing grey eyes, sickly, patchy skin. The reason I'm mentioning the details of his face is to highlight that this wasn't a mask. He's got this big smile plastered on his face, and his eyes are so wide they look like they're bulging out of his skull. This expression is frozen on his face. As we get closer to one another, his head turns so that he can keep his unblinking eyes fixed on me. A little creeped out, I give him a polite nod. He gives me nothing in return, just that wide-eyed, toothy smile. As we finally cross by each other, his head is turned to the side, his vision still fixed on me. I continue past him, but I'm on guard for obvious reasons. What the hell was this guy doing out in these woods, so far from civilization? There wasn't a house besides our cabin for miles. I glance over my shoulder to check that he's not following me. The blood drains from my face when I see him. He's still walking away from me, but his head is facing me, like it's on backwards, an impossible angle, that messed up expression still on his face. I'm overcome by this sinking feeling, and I sprint off deeper into the woods. I want to put as much distance between me and him as possible. When I feel safe enough, I slow down and slap myself back into reality. The birds are chirping like normal again. Whoever that man was, he was walking in the direction of our cabin, but none of my family members caught sight of him. If this was some sort of prank, then I have no idea how he managed to get that effect. It was too real. Nor can I think why he'd be out in those woods, all by himself, where he'd most likely encounter no one. I still get nervous when I pass by strangers in the woods, and I always turn to check that they're not keeping an eye on me after I've passed them. It's everyone's worst nightmare. You come home by yourself from a long day at work and enter your dark, empty house. Only, it's not as empty as you were expecting. On the night of September 6th, 2006, Susan Kuhnhausen got back from her long shift at the hospital, walked through her front door, and into her bedroom. Strange, she thought. The room isn't usually this dark. Wait, did I forget to open the curtains this morning? From behind the door, a man appeared. A man she had never seen or spoken to before. His name's Edward Dalton Haffey, and he's holding a black claw hammer. What this guy didn't realize was that Susan Kuhnhausen was a badass. Fight or flight immediately kicks in. She had seen and dealt with a lot of shit as a nurse, so her instinct wasn't to run. On top of that, she had been trained in self-defense and knew that crowding the guy would lessen the impact of his hammer swings. So she gets close. Wham! The hammer strikes her in the left temple, but the would-be killer can't generate enough force to take her down. She's dazed and bloody, but getting close had worked. Susan knows that she's fighting for her life at this point. Anyone that aims for the head with a hammer is aiming to kill. She tries to reason with him, but Haffey won't listen. He's hellbent on taking her out. Now she tries to use her superior weight to knock him down, but he manages to push her away. "You're strong," he says, the only words he uttered the whole encounter. It's then that Susan managed to wrestle the hammer out of her assailant's hands. She takes it and slams it into his head several times in quick succession. Haffey goes down, but he manages to grab the hammer back. That's when Susan grabbed him by the throat and began strangling him. His face turns purple. Terrified, she makes for the exit. But Haffey isn't dead. Susan doesn't know it, but he's got a near-lethal amount of cocaine in his system. Nothing's gonna slow him down. He grabs her as she tries to escape and punches her in the face twice, knocking her to the ground. As he stood over her, Brandishing his claw hammer, Susan knew that she was as good as dead. But the fighter inside her triumphed. Susan chose a life over death. She somehow manages to get him on the ground with her and puts him in a chokehold. She screams at him, demanding to know why he was trying to kill her. "Tell me," she says. "Tell me, and I'll call you an ambulance." Eventually, his face turns purple again. This time, permanently. She had strangled Haffey to death. An ambulance was called, and statements were taken. It was obvious that Susan had acted in self-defense. The question remained, however. Why had Haffey decided to kill Susan that evening? As it turns out, the question that the police should have been focusing on was who had sent him. You see, Haffey was a hitman. He was paid $50,000 to sneak into Susan's house and beat her to death. When the police searched the crime scene, they didn't find anything that might reveal the identity of whoever hired Haffey. It wasn't until one of Susan's friends came over to her place and noticed an out-of-place backpack in her basement that the crime was finally solved. Inside the backpack was a container of Hershey's syrup, $200 in cash, diabetes pills, and a notebook containing a cell number. Next to it, Haffey had written, "Call Mike." Mike. That was Susan's husband. Her estranged husband, to be precise. The pair had been separated for a while at this point, and since their breakup, Mike hadn't been doing so well for himself. He'd lost his job at the local adult video store and had no place to live. But he and Susan were still technically married. If she were to suddenly catch a bad case of having her brains bashed in, he'd inherit the house. So he made a deal with Haffey, a former co-worker at the porno shack. Kill his so-called bitch of a wife, sell the house, and earn a sixth of the place's value, 50 large. Mike still had a spare key to Susan's, and knew all of the alarm codes. If all went well, there'd be nothing to link him to the crime. It was perfect. What he didn't plan on, though, was his Vietnam vet hitman being killed by his former partner. Down at the station, he came up with a half-assed alibi, but the police weren't buying it. He got 7 years in jail, but died of cancer on Friday the 13th of June, 2014, only 92 days before he was due to be released. If this incident teaches us anything, it's that love can be a dangerous game, especially when you fall out of it and there's money on the line. Thankfully, Susan survived her ordeal. "If you can't run and you can't hide, you have to fight," she said. "You don't know that you won't survive." This isn't a family curse that affects my family, but rather my friends. Every year, on May 25th, all of his family gather together at one of their homes and spend the next 24 hours in the same room together. Nobody leaves until midnight, and nobody ever leaves the eyeshot of another family member. They don't sleep. They just spend the time eating and talking, waiting the day out. If one of them needs to go to the bathroom, they'll go in groups and keep each other in their sights. When my friend and his siblings were kids, they thought this was just some family tradition that every family in America took part in. As they got older, their mother let them know that there was a much more serious reason they did this. For as long as the family on their mother's side could remember, every year, on the 25th of May, one of their relatives would go missing. In the past, this seemed to happen without fail. Some would eventually turn up dead, but for the most part, they just disappeared, never to be seen or heard from again. It could be any one of their blood relatives that happened to go missing on the day. A cousin, an uncle, an aunt. As long as they shared blood with that side of the family, they were at risk of vanishing, at risk of falling victim to the family curse. Sort of like a deadly version of roulette, if you will. Generations ago, when their family started to notice a pattern emerging, the various related households created the tradition of coming together on the same day every year. By keeping an eye on each other, nobody was ever going to vanish into thin air. In the years when everyone in the family stuck to the plan, it worked, and nobody would go missing. This had apparently been going on in their family for centuries, before any living family member could remember at least. Everyone would just come together, stick together, and wait the day out. Occasionally, a cousin or someone might decide that the whole Mayday family curse was hogwash, and go off to do something else by themselves. If they spent any of May 25th alone, even just like driving somewhere or going to the bathroom by themselves, then it was going to be their year to take the bullet. One year, my friend's second cousin, Tony, ignored the family ritual and went off to see a concert with some friends instead. 3 weeks later, they found his body off the side of the motorway. He had lost control of his car and crashed into a tree. Took people ages to find him for some reason. According to my friend, 2 other family members had gone missing in his lifetime alone. He has no idea what happened to them. Nobody in the family does. Whatever you make of this story, I think it's pretty interesting. And I know for a fact that my friend and his family still have these gatherings every year. They don't spend 1 minute of that particular day out of eyeshot. And if the story's true, I can't say I blame them. Well, it wouldn't be a Lazy Masquerade mystery video if we didn't have at least a few more creepy doe reconstructions. Those artist depictions of unidentified bodies. Oh, I just love digging deep into the uncanny valley. A lot of people wonder why the reconstruction artists make their subjects look so inhuman. I mean, surely they'd want to make them look as close as how they looked in reality as possible, right? Well, actually, the opposite is true. By making the images too realistic, they run the risk of making the victim look like any other generic person. If the picture they create could literally be anyone, then it wouldn't stay fresh in people's minds, or might not catch the attention of someone who actually knew the victim. Instead, the police intentionally accentuate certain distinguishing features about the dead person. For example, this woman. From her body, the police could tell that she had a very crooked neck. Sure, it's very creepy, but it stays in your head and makes you think if you know anyone who had a crooked neck. In this way, the images are more likely to ring a few bells. When the police released this image of a Jane Doe in 2012, you might have thought it was unlikely anyone would have recognized the woman. It's barely recognizable as human to begin with. Looks more like something you'd see in a particularly creepy episode of Courage the Cowardly Dog. At the time, she was known only as Suitcase Body. Police had found the half-decomposed corpse of a young woman stuffed into a suitcase along a Wisconsin highway. Judging from how decomposed she was, she must have been dead for at least a year. They had absolutely no leads, nor any idea of who she was. What they did know was that she had a very chipmunk-like face. So, that's what they asked their artist to highlight in this reconstruction. Their hope was that it might help solve the mystery of who she was, and, in turn, reveal who left her in the suitcase. Amazingly, this creepy image served its purpose. The Jane Doe, known only as Suitcase Body, was actually 19-year-old Jenny Gamis from Cottage Grove, Oregon. You might not see the likeness. I know I couldn't. But the reconstruction was enough to draw the attention of Jenny's foster mother, Lorraine. She hadn't heard from Jenny in a good long while. Jenny had moved away, but it still seemed strange that she had cut off all contact. Police checked Jenny's dental records, which confirmed that the body in the suitcase was indeed hers. Over a year after her murder, Suitcase Body had finally reclaimed her identity. Sadly, Jenny wasn't her killer's only victim. On the same stretch of highway, another suitcase was found, this one containing another woman's body. This victim's identity wasn't so hard to trace. She was Laura Simonson, a 37-year-old from Farmington, Minnesota. So who was responsible for all of this? Well, it took them a while to crack the case, but eventually the police were led to the home of the killer. Stephen Zelich, an ex-cop. While an officer in West Allis, he abused his powers by stalking women in the area and gaining access to their personal information. He resigned in 2001 to avoid disciplinary action. That way, he could still go on to become a private security officer. He met both Jenny and Laura in online BDSM chat rooms under the username Mr. Handcuffs. On separate occasions, he convinced both of them to meet him in his hotel room. Then, they engaged in what Zelich called breath play, a dangerous sex game involving strangulation. The girls were bound and gagged, with a rope tied around their necks. He then pulled on the rope to asphyxiate them, something that gave him a sense of erotic satisfaction. Both women died so that this guy could get off. He then kept their bodies hidden in his refrigerator for months, and then eventually dumped them. In court, he claimed that both of their deaths had been accidental. Right, because if you accidentally killed someone in this way, you'd dump their body off in a suitcase and do it all over again. The jurors saw through this poor attempt at avoiding responsibility. He was found guilty of their murders, and will remain in prison until the day he dies. This is honestly a little freaky, and makes me a bit terrified whenever I think about it, to be honest. Still, I'm willing to share. I live in England, in an old, beautiful cottage that's been in my family since my great-grandfather bought it all those years ago. Prior to him, my ancestors had all been very poor, and could scarcely afford to put a roof over their heads. The story goes that when my great-grandfather was a young man, he set off by himself up to Scotland. Several years later, he returned a rich man, and was able to buy the family cottage. He never spoke about how he made his fortune. Well, he did, but not definitively. The story always changed. One day, he might tell you it was from a business venture. Then another day, he might tell you he got lucky gambling, or made a pact with a gypsy. There were so many different answers that he gave, that eventually, people just stopped asking altogether. Perhaps he'd come into the money illegally, they thought. That's why he always avoided answering the question. My family at the time couldn't have cared less if that was the case, to be honest. They could finally eat, drink, and buy whatever they wanted, and didn't have to scrounge to make ends meet. Anyway, over the generations, the money that my great-grandfather accumulated was added to, and to this day, we remain quite well off. The problem is, money wasn't all that my ambitious relative brought back with him from north of the border. You see, not long after buying the cottage, and still young at the age of 29, he suddenly lost his sanity. That is to say, that overnight, he went completely mad. He started complaining about a thin, red man that kept following him. We know this from the journals that my great-grandfather kept. According to him, the thing, for lack of a better word, was a bony, emaciated humanoid with sunken eye sockets and paper-thin lips that didn't fully cover its teeth. It didn't wear any clothes. It was just completely red, like it was constantly bleeding all over, like a human man if all of the skin had been stripped from him. He said he could see it watching him wherever he went, climbing on walls and ceilings. The last entry talks about how the thing kept whispering to him as he slept, that it kept him up all night, every night, and how he couldn't take it anymore. The next day, he took his hunting shotgun and shot himself in the head, leaving his wife and his young son, my grandfather, alone. Time goes by, and my grandfather, Winston, grows up to be a successful businessman himself. Just like his father before him, he found a wife and had some children of his own at a young age. The oldest of these children was a son, my father. Unfortunately, just like his father again, my grandfather also lost his mind exactly 10 years later in life than his father. At the age of 39, he started screaming about being followed by a red figure. He said that the thing creature stalked him and would appear out of the blue when he least expected it. He handled these hallucinations better than my great-grandfather had been able to. For all intents and purposes, life went on for him. But sadly, the hallucinations persisted and got worse over time. According to my grandmother, he used to say that the thin red man wouldn't leave him alone anymore. Finally, 10 long months after becoming mentally ill, he was found dead in the pond of the family estate. According to the coroner's report, my grandfather had been sleepwalking and somehow managed to unconsciously make his way to the pond outside. For whatever reason, he didn't wake up and drowned in the water. I never met either of those men. They both died before I was born, obviously. I've only ever read my great-grandfather's journal and listened to stories about my grandfather. My own father, however, I of course knew very well, and his story is what haunts me the most. Like his father and his father before him, he met a girl and had a family at a young age. I was the eldest of his children. I'm grateful that I got to know my father growing up. He was a kind man, funny too, and very smart. He always took care of my mother, myself, and my siblings. Our youths were amazing. When my father turned 49, I noticed that something wasn't right at home. He and my mother kept his mental condition a secret from us youngsters, but eventually the truth slipped out. While home alone with my dad, he broke out into sweats and started telling me that he was seeing the thin red man. This was the first time I'd ever heard someone telling me about seeing the creature firsthand. He said it was just like it had been described in the journal, the stuff of nightmares. Thin, tall, and bony. He often saw it late at night while in bed, crawling across the ceiling of the bedroom, twisting its head backwards to stare down at him. My father held out for a little over a year, suffering from constant night terrors, which over time became day and night terrors. Things seemed to get worse and worse, and no amount of medical assistance seemed to do a thing. Eventually, he took his own life. I don't want to go into details about that, but it was definitely deliberate. I miss him greatly. We all do. As it stands, I'm 26 years old. I too met a girl whilst I was away at university, and the two of us are currently planning our wedding. She wants to start a family, and to be honest, so do I. I'm inclined to believe that all of these deaths in my family have been the result of a genetical mental illness, one which I hope I won't develop. I'll definitely be keeping an eye on it, I can tell you that much. I like to think that the only reason my father and grandfather saw the same red figure was because they had both heard about it from my grandfather's journal. They had read the story so many times that it had just slipped into their subconscious. So, when they started to lose grip of reality, their hallucinations manifested into this red man. Still, I'd be lying if I said that the thought that this could be a family curse didn't affect me, seeing as I'm my family's firstborn son. For whatever reason, it seems to only affect the men in our family. I just hope that I never meet this thin red man face to face. And, for the sake of our first future baby, I really hope it's a girl. While I was growing up, My family would visit the same lake every year for a week every summer. We'd stay in the same cabin every time. As we got older, we would visit a large rock we called the Cliffs and jump off it. The rock was only 15 feet tall at its highest point, but the water was really, really deep. When we got older, we'd jump in and try to touch the bottom, but we never could. When my brother and I were in our teens, we took kayaks out to the cliffs to jump off on our own. We jumped off several times, and when we got too cold, we'd take a break on the top of the cliffs to warm up in the sun. As we were sitting there, we noticed a white shape in the water, floating towards the surface. It was a letter. H. Eventually, it sank back down into the water, and we lost sight of it. Before we could look away or say anything, another shape was floating upwards. It was the letter E. Eventually, it too sank below, but it was soon followed by 2 more letters, L and P. We didn't jump in after that. We stood up and left without saying a word. We never mentioned it to anyone, and I forgot it even happened after a while. Several years ago, I was working as a camp counselor, and I told this as a ghost story. I'd forgotten about it, and I texted my brother to see if I hadn't just made it up completely. I asked him if he remembered the time we went to the jumping cliffs alone and saw something in the water. He replied yes, that he did remember. I asked him what it was, and his reply was, letters. They spelled help. This happened on a Norwegian peninsula when I was about 15 years old. It must have been 2006, give or take a year. Regardless, it was Halloween night, and I didn't really have any plans. Too old for trick-or-treating, too young for partying. It was a small peninsula anyway, so there wasn't much going on. I was just sat at home, playing RuneScape on my desktop. This continued until sundown. You could say I was mildly addicted to that game. I usually like to play with the lights off. Bad for your eyes, but I like the mood it set. Anyway, it's around 9 PM. My mum comes into my room and pats me on the shoulder. "Didn't you hear me? I said I'm going out for 20 minutes, she said. I had my noise-cancelling headphones on, so I was oblivious to the fact that she'd been shouting to me. She heads downstairs, and I hear the door slam. I put my headphones back on, and sink back into my own little pixelated world. As such, I can't really tell you how much time passed when this happened. When you looked out of my bedroom door, which at the time was wide open, you could see down into the long corridor leading to my mum's room opposite. Since all of the lights were off, I could only really make out the outlines of all the objects, and that was only after my eyes adjusted after looking at the bright computer screen. Until then, it was like looking into a dark void of total blackness. You know when one of your senses has picked up on something that you're not totally conscious of yet, and you feel a little uneasy? Well, that happened to me while I was playing. It felt like someone else was around me, like that I'm being watched sensation. I figure my mum came back from wherever she went, and that I just hadn't heard her due to my headphones. But if that was the case, why hadn't she turned the lights on? I looked down into the dark corridor. At the far end, something's glowing. It's large and fluorescent green. It's spherical. Looks like a floating orb of some kind. I freak out and whip off my headphones. After looking at it for a moment, it becomes clear that this isn't an orb at all, or anything supernatural like that. There's 2 black holes where eyes should be, and a dark slit for a mouth. It's a glow-in-the-dark mask, and it's not floating. Someone's wearing it. Whoever it is facing me. I can't make out the rest of their body, but the head is definitely looking in my direction and is slowly inching closer. It's some sort of distorted, expressionless face. It's hard to describe, but the image of it is burned deep into my memory. Realizing he's been spotted, the guy freezes. We just stare at each other for what felt like the longest time. He raises a finger up to the lips of his mask. Shh. I'm just a trick-or-treater. It's a thick, manly voice. One I didn't recognize. In a state of shock, and not really knowing how to react, I just sit there, keeping my eyes on him. So, trick or treat? I mumble out, neither. Please go now. But he doesn't go. The glowing face starts moving towards me. Desperate to keep him out of my bedroom, I leap up and slam my door closed, locking it and pressing the full weight of my body against it. The guy is just outside my door. I can hear his deep breaths on the other side. He tries the door handle. It rattles. More heavy breaths. He tries the handle again. Then I can hear quick footsteps moving down the stairs, and what I think is my front door opening and closing. Still in shock, I just sit in my barricaded room, sobbing to myself until my mum finally returns. It felt like forever since I'd last seen her. She asked me what was wrong, why I was crying, and why there was a large Hessian sack left in the corridor. I told her what had just happened. She called the police for me immediately. I like to think that this was just a crazy person, and that they didn't really have any intention of harming me. Just some sort of messed up Halloween prank. Whatever the case, it was a surreal experience, and the image of that floating, talking face has haunted me for the longest time. The most unnerving part about this to me, though, is the fact that the peninsula really was very small. For me to see a face around town that I didn't recognize was very rare. More than likely, someone in my family knew who this person was. Hell, I probably knew who it was. I hate to think that after that event, I may very well have interacted with that person. The thought that they specifically targeted me out of everyone in the area made me extremely uncomfortable. I never felt safe there after that. That's part of the reason I moved away when I was 18. This isn't a date story, but the guy involved did try to use his charm to deadly effect. Had my own circumstances been different, well, you'll see. It happened in California in May of 2015. I had graduated college in June of 2014 and moved back to my old hometown. Started a consulting company with my boyfriend, which was going very well. We had just finished a contract in the Bay Area, and were beginning a new one about 8 hours south of Torrance. He moved down there first to start setting up, while I took care of the loose ends at our closing contract before moving down to meet him. The day comes, and I pack my car and head south down the I-5. For the uninitiated, it's a straight highway with little in the way of scenery, aside from the occasional strip mall. Its monotony has a reputation for putting drivers to sleep at the wheel. I pass a strip mall with gas and a fast food joint, and decide to fill up my car and my stomach. I go to park in the food venue's parking lot, but it's completely full. Thus, I park across the street at a hotel, which at the time I didn't think anything of. I go inside and eat my meal, then cross the street to get back to my car. I'm well into the hotel parking lot when a pickup truck pulls down the aisle and cuts off my path. It stops, with the passenger side facing me. The driver is alone. He's a clean-cut white male in his mid-30s. I don't remember anything about him, except that he looked very generic and buttoned up. The way he pulled up in front of me to block my path didn't initially set off any alarm bells. He did it very organically. He rolls down the window and says, "Excuse me, miss, but could you tell me where the grocery store is in this town?" "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not from here, so I couldn't say." "Oh, where are you from?" Good question. I don't know. Not here, though." I didn't say that to be rude. I'd just moved through so many cities at that point and was on my way to a new one, so I wasn't really sure how to answer. He laughs and makes a joke, then asks me where I'm headed. I mention that I'm moving. I will say, he was very charismatic, and at this point, I think he's just trying to flirt with me. If I hadn't been so exhausted or in a relationship, on another day it might have worked. He makes another comment about how unpleasant moving can be, and then he gives me a warm chuckle and extends his hand to shake mine. "Well, I'm glad I got to meet you. I'm Scott." If you recall, the truck is in front of me, with the passenger side facing me. I actually take a step forward to shake his hand, and then got the delayed response of every alarm bell that should have gone off earlier. 1. I'm in a hotel parking lot. 2. He asked me a question that establishes I don't know where I am. 3. Another question that establishes I'm alone. And 4. Another question that establishes I'm not expected at my destination for many hours. The thing that connected all these synapses? When he extended his hand, he didn't make even the faintest effort to make it accessible to me. He didn't move over the seat to move toward me in any way. His hand was hovering comfortably over the center console, waiting for me to grasp it, which, in order to do, I would have had to lean well into the car. Again, I had already taken a step toward him, and I had already begun to raise my hand to shake his when the sirens went off. I rocked backwards, back to where I was standing, and I just remember looking in his eyes for what felt like forever, feeling everything click into place, while also half convinced that my imagination was just running wild. His hand is still waiting. I lowered mine and felt my eyes slightly narrow with suspicion. Slowly, I said, "I'm going to walk away from your car now, Scott." Boom. Truck burns rubber with thick grey smoke as the guy guns it out of the hotel lot at 100 miles an hour. He must have fucking floored it. Regrettably smart on his end, because I didn't have the license number or anything to offer the police. In the immediate minutes following the event, I felt relieved, but hadn't fully processed the full weight of what had just happened. Unfortunately for me, I had many more hours to think back and analyze the whole interaction to shreds. The car was somewhat lifted. There could have easily been another person, or even 2 or 3 other people hiding inside. Would he have pulled me in? Would I have been injected with something? Then my mind just kept creating all these scenarios where I wake up hours later and nobody would have known where in my drive I went missing, or possibly not noticed for most of the day. I still get creeped out thinking about how close I came to taking his hand, and how fortunate I was that I didn't allow my reaction to be driven by manners, which criminals often take advantage of. This didn't just happen to me, but my friends, Macy, Eric, and Dorian too, while we were all out on a trip in northwest Montana. Macy's parents had a cottage out by Flathead Lake. One weekend, we all decided to head over there and do a spot of fishing. In this digital age, it's very easy to lose touch with nature. Personally, I was starting to feel like a caged animal that summer, trapped indoors with no reason to go outside. Well, no reason other than my crappy part-time job. I guess we all just wanted to reconnect with the great outdoors. They say that when you're around old friends, you act the same age that you were when you met them. That was definitely true for us. We were a bunch of 19-year-olds, goofing around like we'd just hit puberty. Some things never change. We get to the cabin, and it's absolutely beautiful. A serene little log cabin, far out in the middle of nowhere. It was nice to get away from the bustle of our town. I mean, the cabin still had internet and everything, so it's not like we were totally living off the grid. But for us, this was going to be a taste of what it felt like to be a real outdoorsman. We all unpack and get to fishing as planned. Not many bites that day, sadly. Dorian wandered off by himself, looking for a better fishing spot. When he finally came back a while later, he seemed a little agitated. He told us that while out fishing a ways away, he heard what he thought was rustling in the tree line to his right. A little concerned about what it might be, he kept an eye on the area. Most of his attention was still focused on his rod in the water when he heard what he thought was a bell ringing from the same spot in the trees. He swore that he saw a figure watching him from the bushes. Not that he could make out many features. He was still a fair distance away, but it looked like he was wearing a hoodie and crouching. That's when he grabbed his gear and hightailed it back to us. This put us all on edge. The closest cabin to ours was far, far away. We weren't expecting to see another soul this whole weekend. Still, it was probably nothing. We called it a day and headed back to the cabin early. We ate dinner and joked around until sunset, though we all kept occasionally glancing out the window. None of us said what we were looking for, but it was obvious that Dorian's story had made us all a little paranoid. Being the dumb kids we were at heart though, we decided to stick around for the night. When you're deep in nature, the nights are particularly dark. No light pollution. Looking out the window was like looking into the abyss unless you pressed your face right up to the glass. Then you could just about make out the outlines of the trees that surrounded us. To us, the slight fear we were all feeling was kind of fun. You know when you're with your buddies and you get spooked by something, but for whatever reason, you all kind of stick around and try to spook each other as well. Well, it was kind of like that. If any of us were by ourselves, we'd have been freaking out, but since we were all together, it was a sort of mini rush. Eventually, it starts getting late and we hit the hay. We're all sleeping in separate areas of the cabin. I'm in the living space on the couch. I'm exhausted from the long day, and the sound of the wind outside is sending me off to sleep. I'm almost out cold when I hear the distinct sound of a bell ringing. It was coming from just outside the front of the cabin. It sounds off once, and then again, and again, sometimes quick and loud, sometimes slow and faint. I'm sitting upright in a heartbeat, and I don't have to call for my friends. They're all congregating in the living space now, keeping their voices low. "It's the guy from the bushes," Dorian whispered to us all. "He's outside the cabin." Pressing my eyes close to the window, I could see that he wasn't wrong. Out in front of the cabin, facing us, was a figure in a goddamn rocking chair. He was sitting stiff, rocking back and forth in the breeze. We have no idea how to react. After a while of watching in fear, Macy, the bravest of the group, opens up the window and shouts to the guy to go away, that his prank wasn't funny. The guy in the chair doesn't react, just sits there, rocking gently, the sound of the bell ringing out. We grab a few knives and cautiously walk out the front door of the cabin, staying in a tight group. I was just following Macy at this point, to be honest, hoping that he knew what he was doing. "Get out of here," Macy shouts as we slowly get closer to the guy. Again, he doesn't react, and for good reason. The guy in the chair isn't alive. It's an old, dead man. We panic. Eric made a break for the tree line before coming to his senses and running back to the cabin with the rest of us. We locked the door and made sure all of the windows were sealed tight. Then we called the authorities. It took what felt like a lifetime for them to finally find us. They were just as weirded out by the dead old man as we were. Examining him in greater detail, they said that whoever he was, he'd been dead for a long time. They could tell from the decomposition. He was most likely disinterred from his grave. Namely, some sicko had dug this poor guy up and put him in that damn rocking chair. Whoever had done this had also tied a small bell around the man's neck, which rang out as the chair rocked back and forth. A very light set of footprints could be made out in the dirt, leading up to the chair from the tree line. The authorities couldn't find a set leading back though, so God knows what direction the perpetrator walked off in. To our knowledge, the investigation never came to anything. Whoever was watching Dorian from the woods that day remains at large. Why they dug up the old man and used him to terrorize us, I have no idea. I once dated this guy who was a skydiving instructor. I'd been on a few jumps before I even met him, but after our second date, he told me that a nighttime skydive was a cool way of mixing things up and experiencing something new. He offered to take me on one of these jumps for our next date, completely free of charge. I excitedly accepted. The night rolls around and we fly up into the sky. I'm strapped to his front, and he has the chute on his back. We're at the door to the plane, ready to jump out. Then, real deadpan, he whispers this in my ear. I like you a lot, Ellie. That's why I've got to tell you something. I've had enough of living, so I cut the cords to the parachute. I'm taking you with me. Then he jumps, with me strapped to him. Since I'm able to retell this story, I don't need to tell you that this was his idea of a funny joke. Yeah, real funny. I spent the whole descent watching the ground get closer and closer, terrified that I was about to splatter into oblivion. Thankfully, the parachute did deploy, and now I can tell you, 3 years after all of that, I married that man. Nah, only joking. I dumped his ass the second my feet hit solid ground. I later learned that night dives are for experienced skydivers only, and that he shouldn't have even taken me up there with him. Guys, listen, girls love a man with a sense of humor. But you know what they say about comedy? It's all about timing. Just choose your moments. My friends and I grew up in Oz, in a pretty run-of-the-mill suburban area. Our circle of friends was large back in the day, but the 4 core members of our little unit were myself and my 3 best friends, Johnny, Kev, and Seth. We were 16 years old at the time, and having a movie night at Seth's house. His parents had gone off to Perth for the weekend, and we had the whole place to ourselves. Well, not just us. Seth was looking after his German Shepherd, a big old doggo called Bonzo. When we had all arrived, our first move was obvious. Help ourselves to Seth's dad's stock of booze. We spent the next few hours playing video games, roasting each other, and fawning over Margot Robbie in The Wolf of Wall Street. We got about halfway through the movie, when there was an unexpected knock on the door. Seth looked confused. He wasn't expecting any more visitors. At his request, I get up and go to the door with him. Maybe we'd been making too much noise and his neighbors were coming over to complain. No. Standing there on the porch was a Domino's Pizza delivery man. He's holding a large pizza box in his hands. Hey, large pepperoni, paid for online? What the hell? We hadn't even thought about ordering a pie. Well, as we all know, 16-year-olds and pizzas are natural allies, so we happily take it off his hands. I mean, prepaid. It was like a gift from the gods themselves. Who were we to say no? Yeah man, that's ours, Seth says. He gives him a couple of bucks for his troubles. You boys have a good night, the guy says, and he heads back to his vehicle. We bring the pizza into the living room, and tell the other two how we'd just lucked out. A massive pizza for just the cost of a tip. Damn, I couldn't even remember the last time I had one of those bad boys. Well, Kev, Mr. Goody Two-Shoes as always, says that we shouldn't just eat somebody else's food. We were moral men after all. He says that the delivery driver couldn't have gotten far, and that there was still time to get him to come back. It was the right thing to do. Plus, if the store realized we'd stolen one of their pizzas, they might not deliver to Seth's house anymore. In the end, Kev managed to convince us. I guess we weren't arseholes after all. The four of us left the pizza on the coffee table and went into the kitchen to call up the pizzeria. We get through to them and tell them that somebody else's pizza had been dropped off at our place, that the guy should come back and get it, and take it to whichever hungry customer ordered it. They ask for our address, and Seth tells them. Are you sure it's a Domino's pizza? Yeah, mate. It's got your logo on the box. We haven't had any orders from that part of town all day. None of our drivers have been around there. Are you sure it's not a Pizza Hut box or something? Dude, I know what your pizzas look like. The delivery guy had your uniform on and everything. Oh, maybe it's from one of our other stores. We'll ask around and get back to you. We were all a little perplexed, mainly because we knew that no other Domino's stores delivered to our area. Figuring this was all just some dumb mix-up, we decided to give them 10 minutes to call us back. If they didn't, well, we'd just dig in. In the meantime, we fixed ourselves some snacks for the rest of the movie. We head back into the living room, and are shocked by what we find. Bonzo the dog had stuffed his face into the box and eaten half of the bloody pizza. Some poor guy had just paid for Seth's dog to eat a sultan's feast. As funny as it all seemed, we were slightly annoyed that our good deed had gone unrewarded. I mean, if someone in the house was going to eat that pizza, we'd have rather it been us. The store never bothered to call us back, so we forgot about the whole thing and just got back to watching the movie. It's not long afterwards that the dog started to become noticeably distressed. He starts whimpering and whining and clambers off to the kitchen. Must be the pizza, we thought. Well, he could wait. It was his own fault after all. And that juicy scene was coming up in the movie. You know which one I mean. In hindsight, we shouldn't have waited. 10 minutes later, we realized that Bonzo was really ill. Thinking he must have gorged himself to the point of near death, we googled for an emergency vet in the area. We found one, and the four of us rushed him there as quickly as we could. Bonzo really was near the point of death when we brought him in, but it wasn't for the reason we expected. The vet said that he was displaying unusual symptoms, convulsing and the like, so we ran a few more tests. What he found churned our stomachs. Traces of strychnine were found in Bonzo's system. It's a seriously dangerous poison, used for killing birds and rodents. When ingested by humans, it causes your body to spasm, your eyes to protrude from your skull, and your brain and other organs to shut down. It only takes about 30 minutes to kill you. We later found out that the cheese on the pizza had been laced with it. Seth's parents came home as soon as they found out, and we told the police everything we could remember about the guy who gave the pizza to us. Sadly, nothing ever came of it in the end. There were no other reports of anyone receiving a poisoned pizza, and it seems like the guy never tried to pull this trick again. This was just a one-off attack of opportunity. It makes me wonder, did the guy specifically target us, thinking that some dumb kids would just selfishly eat a pizza someone else ordered? If so, does that mean he'd been watching us? How else would he have known that Seth's parents weren't in? Could he have been someone they knew? The mind boggles. I'm happy to report that Bonzo did indeed survive the ordeal, if only just. Had we arrived at the vet's 5 minutes later, it's unlikely he would have pulled through. The thought that somebody might target others for no apparent reason terrifies me. If anybody brings food to your door that you didn't order, do the right thing and check with the company it's from. It just might save your life. When I was younger, I went into my bedroom alone to change into my PJs. My mum said I came back and asked her why Peter Pan was at my window and if we could let him in. She of course ran to my bedroom, and sure enough, someone had pulled the screen off my window and had opened it slightly. Needless to say, we moved shortly after that. I was oblivious to what was wrong because, hey, in my eyes, I had just met Peter Pan. So, I was very young when this happened. So young, in fact, that I don't remember a whole lot, only bits and pieces. I'd say that I was 5 or 6 years old. My parents filled in the gaps for me, so I'm gonna tell the whole version of the story, both my parts and theirs. We were living in an old farmhouse at the time. My parents were poor, so they rented from a landlord that owned a few small properties in the area. My dad worked in the steel mill on the midnight shift, so he worked some odd hours. This is relevant because it might be the only reason that we're still alive and that I'm able to write this story today.
Help! He's going to rape me! Help me!
We jolted out of bed and were fully awake in an instant. I was sleeping in my bed with my parents that night because I was having some awful night terrors. My dad, who had just switched from midnight shifts to days, jumped out of bed and cautiously made his way down the stairs, grabbing a stoking pick from the fireplace in the living room. He got to the door when he heard it again.
Help! Help! Oh my God, he's coming!
The woman's voice on the other side of the door began sobbing hysterically. "We have to help her. Open the door," said my mother. My mum is an inherently good woman who always goes out of her way to help people every single day of her life. She reached out for the deadbolt, but my dad stopped her. He shot her a look and said cautiously through the door, "What's going on? Who's after you and where is he?" The voice through the door responded,
I just need to get in before he gets here. Please. Please.
More sobs. My father turned on the porch light and said, "Stay up on the porch with your back against the door." He then opened the deadbolt, but not the chain lock. He slipped a brick that we used as a doorstop through the crack. "Take this and use it to defend yourself if you need it. I'll be right on the other side of this door, and if he comes after you, I'll come out and help. In the meantime, I'm calling the police. They'll be here soon." This is when the woman starts to absolutely lose her mind. She began slamming her whole body into the door with a mindless fury.
What the fuck's wrong with you? Let me in this goddamn house right now. What kind of fucking people are you?
My dad forced the door shut and clicked the deadbolt home again. He immediately called the police, and they came within 10 minutes. When they arrived, the woman was simply gone. The doorstop brick was sitting on one of the porch steps. My parents gave a description of the events and the woman as best they could. We tried our best to get some sleep in the following nights, but my mum and dad checked all of the locks and windows several times throughout the night. I don't remember understanding what happened, but I remember thinking that my parents were acting strange and wondering why they didn't help this woman. I thought the man snuck up and got her while we were calling the police. A few days later, we found out that the police had been called for a similar situation at a different house. My dad's brother-in-law worked in law enforcement and told us that that time the police happened to have a car down the street and arrived without lights and sirens. The officers saw the woman that my parents had described at the front door on top of the porch. When they began walking up to her, a man dashed out of the bushes from the side of the porch. They chased him down pretty quickly and recovered a long kitchen knife from the bushes where he had been hiding. The man and the woman had been working together to try to gain entry to houses. The police surmised that the woman would get people to open their doors and let her in, and then she would let her partner in. God only knows what they would have done once they got inside. Once I heard this story and put it together with my memories of the event, it sent chills down my spine. Imagine what would have happened if my dad had been working the midnight shifts, or if he had just been asleep. He grew up in a very bad neighborhood, Gary, Indiana, so he was always cautious about people around him. Usually it was mildly irritating, but that time it may have saved our lives. Having grown up in Eastern Europe, I have more than a few stories I could share from my childhood. Perhaps the closest call happened when I was 6 or 7 years old. It may only be because of my father's wisdom that I'm able to tell this story today. I was in my room playing computer games when a van outside caught my attention. It was an old white thing that had been parked at the beginning of our street. I remember the guy's face that got out of it. He looked like any other normal guy you might pass in town. Just your average working man. From what I could tell, he was going from door to door, no doubt trying to sell something. Eventually, there's a knock on our door. My father goes to answer it. He opens the door, and the guy from the van is standing on our porch. From what I could overhear, the guy said that he was a home security salesman, and asked my dad if he'd be interested in having some cameras and alarms installed. My dad calmly and confidently told him that we already had a home security system, that it was set up all around the house, and that it was working perfectly. The salesman smiles, says no problem in a friendly tone, and moves along to the other houses down our street. 2 days pass, and I wake up on a Sunday morning to find our street filled with police cars. Like the salesman before, investigators are going door to door, asking people questions. Our turn comes around, and again, my dad answers the door. The officer standing on our front porch greets my father, and in a very matter-of-fact way, tells him that somebody had broken into one of our neighbors' homes and murdered the entire family inside. My dad talks with them for a while. I didn't know what about at the time. My mother sent me into another area of the house, not wanting me to hear about the details of the murder. As I would later find out, all 5 members of the household had been beaten to death with a hammer while they slept. Mother, father, and children. A whole family wiped out. Sometime later, we're watching the television. They start talking about the murder case on the news. Apparently, the killer had been arrested. A man's face flashes up on the screen. 3 guesses as to who it was. My child brain hadn't been able to put 2 and 2 together, but for the adults down our street, the answer must have been as clear as day. It was the salesman. As he went to each house in our street, he hadn't been trying to sell home security. He was scouting for vulnerable homes to target. Our house didn't have any kind of security whatsoever. No alarms, no cameras, no nothing. But my dad instinctively knew not to tell the guy that, and responded instantly. Had he paused for a moment, the salesman may have seen through his lie. Then he might have chosen to pay us a visit that night. The creepiest part to me is that the salesman didn't give off a creepy vibe. He appeared to be just a normal, regular guy. I learned a very valuable lesson that day. When someone comes to your door and tries to sell you home security, always tell them that you already have it, and that it's working perfectly. When I was 20 years old, so 6 years ago, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired for losing his license, I was placed on the night shift. I really didn't want that shift, because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza, or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was an arsehole, and essentially told me that if I wasn't willing to take the night shift, I was fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of this shift went by without any issues. That is, until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punched it into our GPS, and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrive, and it's about 11 PM. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses. The house I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait about another 30 seconds. Still, no answer. I'm standing there, getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down. But, thankfully, a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 foot, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here, and he just stands there, staring at me. I ask him if he's okay, and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry. I got off work not too long ago, and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money. I hand him the pizza. And as I'm making change, he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight, and he did too.
Narrator narrates
I
all.
walked back to my car and finished my
Narrator
deliveries for
off.
the night. A few days later, I get a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time, and again ring the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly and said, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and that I couldn't wait to go home, which he chuckled at. "I know that feeling pretty well," he said as he was pulling out his wallet. As he's counting his money, he asks what my name is. Being kinda tired at this point, and not really thinking too straight, I stupidly tell him my name. As I'm making change, he asks if he could have my number, as he'd, quote-unquote, love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I've literally only met this guy like twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked about 15, and I was hoping that he thought differently, and wasn't hitting on me because he thought I was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds, before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay, I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and still stands at the doorway, staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy and even brought it up with my co-workers. They agreed it was pretty creepy. They all agreed, that is, except for my boss, who overheard everything and claimed that I was just making up stories for sympathy. Fucking arsehole. A week later, I'm working the night shift, and we get an order from that same guy again. This is when shit really hits the fan. I arrive at the house around 10:30 PM. Keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in that house was on. I get out of my car and I walk up to the front door with the pizza box. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man. Except this time, he was wearing a suit. I jumped back. He laughs and says, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out of the window and figured I'd just open the door now so you wouldn't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in his house whatsoever. He was just sitting in the dark this whole time? If so, why? I nervously laugh and say it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asks me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" What the fuck? I once again tell him that I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets close to me, and says, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it to the side. He then grabs me by my arms, hard. I'm officially shitting bricks at this point, and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading with him. "Dude, please, I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He just stares at me with the most sinister look I have ever seen on someone's face, and says, "I don't care. Get inside, now. We're gonna have a good time." He starts trying to pull me into his house, and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms and starts grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. I did something that, to this day, I am thankful worked. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in the stomach. This stuns him for a few seconds, and he loosens his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in, he runs at me and starts trying to pull me out, holding the knife in the other hand. "Why are you making this so fucking difficult?" I grab a half-empty bottle of soda I had in the cup holder and throw it. Luckily, it hits him in the head, and he lets go. I slam the door, and then, all of a sudden, he jumps right on the hood of my car and starts scratching and banging on my windshield with the knife. I put the car in reverse and quickly back out of the spot, reversing down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood, screaming, "Stop the fucking car!" I turn onto the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily, he falls off the hood of my car. I slam the gas as hard as I could to get as far away from that sick bastard as possible. In my panicked state, I drove a couple of blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto other side blocks as I feared he was following me. Eventually, I reached a red light, and I slammed on the brakes and just sat there at the intersection, frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me that I had just come close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel that I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there, crying. Eventually, I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworker knew that something was wrong with me. I practically broke down in front of him, and everyone else came to the front, wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had just happened and for putting me on the night shift. He takes me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrive at the store, and I give them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself and any scratches on my car. My coworker followed me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed. Strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily, a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later, I received an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife. The psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later on, it was for sex crimes. He had been released from jail for about 5 months before this encounter. When the cops arrived at the house, he was long gone, and his family had no idea where he had run off to. The police insisted that they would find him. Indeed, they did. Only not alive. Apparently, the guy had fled to a nearby city and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking alone late at night on the street. Luckily, somebody happened to be looking out their window at the right time. They called the cops, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He manages to flee, and the police chase after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard, and a van slammed right into the driver's side of the car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries. The psycho, on the other hand, succumbed to his wounds long before the ambulance even arrived. I thanked the officers for everything they had done and for informing me, and I walked out of the station. I walked down the street and light up a cigarette, taking in everything I had just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I would never have to encounter him again, and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and Airbnb hostess here in Seoul. The site's become massive. There's something like 2 million properties listed on it, so no matter where you're traveling to in the world, chances are that there's somebody with a room or a condo or even an entire house to rent. During her time hosting, Nari met a whole bunch of colourful characters. There were the sweet older couple that came to stay with her 8 times while visiting friends in the city. There was the guy who insisted on bringing his dog with him, this little rat-sized chihuahua that was about half the size of my cat's. There were a few people who were high maintenance, and there were a few who were really chilled, and ended up joining us for drinks at the bar down the street. I never hosted personally, but I'd help Nari out with her bookings if she had to work late and needed someone to meet her guests. Well, for all the good people, there was Mr. Park. He was this creepy, balding guy that stayed with Nari for a week while he was in town on business. At least, he said that was his reason anyway. I think we were both relieved when he left. I'd met him once, and didn't like the vibe I got off the guy, and there wasn't much she could do to kick him out early or anything, lest he gave her a bad review and dropped her score on the site. After he left, Nari discovered a weird plastic thing he had left in the shower. Turns out, he had left his slimy, fake vagina masturbation aid sitting next to her soap. I took one look and had to explain to her what it was. I remember her picking it up in a plastic bag, like the way people scoop up dog shit on the street. From then on, Nari was pretty picky when it came to who she let stay. One weekend, Nari had to leave for a business trip, so she left me the spare key. She had a booking coming up, a young woman named Sumi, and I was to play host. We'll just call her Sue from here. Sue checked in, got the key from me, and put her suitcase in the spare room. I didn't see any more of her that Friday, or for the rest of the weekend, and I figured she was out enjoying herself. Not too long after that, I could have sworn I saw Mr. Park in our local grocery store. Same balding head, same vibe, but he was at one end of the aisle and I the other. I got that feeling like I was being watched, but when I looked directly, he was gone. At the time, I shrugged it off, figured it had to be some other balding guy, and I was just projecting my anxiety. Now, the building I live in is fairly old, which means that the walls are pretty thick, and noise tends to only travel in the hallway. If I'm waiting for the elevator, I can occasionally hear someone's TV if it's really loud, but that's about it. That Monday morning, I was woken up far too early by a pounding sound. It was maybe 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and the sun was barely up. At that point, I was pissed. I threw on a housecoat and yanked open the front door without bothering to look in the peephole. I was greeted by 2 very tense policemen. They asked for my name, and if I knew the young woman who lived across the hall from me, pointing to Nari's apartment. Without thinking, I ran across the hall and through the open door, just knowing in my gut that Nari was supposed to be returning that morning, and that something must be wrong if there were police at my door. The cops yelled for me to wait, but I was on autopilot. At first, I thought someone had robbed the place. Her TV was smashed, her couch was ripped apart like it had been mauled by a bear, her photos were buried under broken glass, her laptop had practically melted into the floor. And then I realized, in some part of my brain, that her TV and laptop wouldn't be here if it was a simple robbery. And that's when I smelled it. Death has a certain stench to it. Sometimes, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, like a hospital corridor, you'll get a whiff of it. What I smelled was a full-on, closed-handed fist slug into the face. In a panic, I couldn't stop myself. I flung open the first bedroom door. Nari's room looked just like the living room, but she wasn't in it. By this time, the officers had caught up with me, and were trying to steer me back out of the unit, but I broke free of their grasp and flung open the spare bedroom door. Inside was what was left of Sue. We get so desensitized to violence on TV that when we're actually confronted with it in real life, it seems almost absurd, like it's totally unreal. She had literally been torn to shreds with a knife. Just from smelling the air alone, I could taste that metallic flavor of blood in the back of my mouth. I showered several times a day for the next week and could not get that taste, that smell out of my hair or skin. It turns out that Sue had been there since Friday night. Nari got home a few hours later. By that time, the forensics team had already been in and out and were starting to clean up the scene. I couldn't tell her about what I'd seen. I just remember hugging her. While investigating, the police had found a second set of keys. This meant there was actually a third set of keys to Nari's place, and those keys had prints. 3 guesses as to who they traced back to. Mr. Park. Park had made a set of keys while staying at Nari's, and he wasn't here on business as he had claimed. It turns out he lived about 15 minutes outside of the city. Security camera footage showed him coming into the building that Friday night, and him lurking around outside for the past month prior to that, just after his stay. Surprisingly, Park confessed to the murder, said he didn't know that Nari would be out of town, that he hadn't known she had had a guest that weekend. His wife had recently left him and taken the kids with her, and Nari reminded him of a younger version of his wife. Nari and I have both moved buildings since then. I still can't believe that all of this came because of broken trust. By giving a stranger a safe place to stay, by letting him into her home, this person was so twisted that he thought to make a copy of her key. If it had been any other weekend, Nari would have been at home, and what happened to Sue would have happened to her too. This is a story I didn't personally experience. I was told it by a good friend of mine, Yori, and it takes place in Fukuoka many years ago. It's a pretty wild tale, but Yori's not the kind of guy to just make something like this up. Every time he tells it, He speaks with conviction and sincerity, and I for one totally believe him. In his youth, he had a friend called Takeshi. Now this guy was a real rebel by Japanese standards, especially back in the day. For example, his favorite pastime was apparently getting drunk and then going to a pinsaron. Pinsarons are basically blowjob clubs. Sometimes he'd get all the guys drunk, Yori included, and drag them all along to this dominatrix bar. Ever the showman, Takeshi liked to get on stage and have beautiful women drip hot wax on his body. Yori's got a million of these stories, so his old rebellious chum must have been quite fun to be around. As their group of friends got older, they all started to mature. All of them, that is, except for Takeshi. He still went out pretty much nightly. Considering Takeshi's lifestyle, it didn't surprise Yori all that much when he told him about his new girlfriend, a girl he had met at a strip club. Her name was Miku. It's not like they happened to just bump into each other. She was actually one of the strippers at this place called Asobi, and they met while she gave him a lap dance. Now, if you think that dating a stripper sounds like a bad idea, then you're a lot smarter than Takeshi was. What the poor guy failed to realize was that Asobi was run by the Yakuza, pretty much the Japanese mafia. These guys are no joke, and even wannabe tough guys like Takeshi knew better than to meddle in their affairs. Problem was, he had been hanging around with Miku for the past 2 weeks before she dropped this bombshell. According to Yori, Miku was crazy. Like real stripper crazy. She was also totally obsessed with Takeshi, and would momentarily lose her mind if she even saw him glance in the direction of another girl. Or, God forbid, if one tried to talk to him. Takeshi was a good-looking guy, so this happened more than once. He'd have to pry her off them, kicking and screaming. Then, as quickly as she had lost her shit, she'd zen out and be totally normal again. Takeshi had been thinking about cutting things off with her, since she was just major trouble. This new Yakuza development pushed him to do so. He dumped her as soon as she told him, calling her crazy, a mental train wreck, and that even though she was hot, she was nowhere near hot enough to risk a Yakuza beating. She went ballistic, right there in the middle of the street, with everyone standing around. Said that she didn't want her boyfriend to say such horrible things about her, but that if he apologized, she'd forgive him because she just loved him that much. If he didn't apologize, she'd make sure he never called her such things again. She'd make him eat those words. He told her where to stick it, turned his back on her and walked away. In Takeshi's head, that was the end of it. That night, Takeshi went out for some drinks with the guys to celebrate being a free man again. Told them all about Miku's Yakuza ties, and how he had just dodged a real bullet. He joked about how she had gone crazy in the street. Well, Yori and the guys warned him to stay safe. Miku was unstable after all. Brushing off their concern, Takeshi stumbled home and into bed. In the early hours of the morning, a visitor came knocking. It was Miku, and she wasn't alone. A couple of Yakuza goons held down Takeshi, while Miku produced a pair of scissors. The gangsters wrenched Takeshi's mouth open and pulled out his tongue. "I warned you this would happen, my love," she said. "I just hate it when you say such horrible things." With the pair of scissors in one hand, Miku held his tongue tight and went to work. Turns out she was a girl of her word, and Takeshi really was forced to eat his. He developed a bit of a speech impediment after that, as you can probably imagine. With the police not willing to get involved in Yakuza business, Takeshi was left up shit creek without a paddle. Miku actually wanted to keep their relationship going, and what Miku wanted, Miku got. Yori said that Takeshi wasn't about to roll over and become some sort of boyfriend slave. Through gargled words, he told him that he planned on getting rid of Miku, one way or another. I asked Yori if he was successful or not. He said he didn't know. Takeshi went missing not long after, and nobody ever heard from him again. Miku suddenly stopped working at Asobi, and the police only half-heartedly looked into the case. The way Yori sees it, 3 things could have happened to Takeshi. Scenario 1. He used his brain for once in his life, took his car and fled the city, started a new life somewhere. Scenario 2. The Yakuza got to him and took him out to the hills, buried him in a deep grave, hopefully not still alive. Or Scenario 3. The Yakuza got to him with Miku, and are keeping him somewhere as her plaything. He really hopes it's not that last one. Two months after my brother and his wife bought a new house, they had to go out of town and needed their cats fed. Their house and my office are both a good drive from my apartment, but only a few minutes from each other. My brother said if I wanted, I could just stay over in the guest room rather than driving among the 3 places. So I got the keys and instructions and planned to stay there for 3 nights: Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday. Monday evening was uneventful until around midnight. I was lying on the living room couch watching Conan, with a cat lying on my chest. I started to drift off to sleep. The next thing I knew, I was standing in pitch black darkness. I completely freaked out. I had no idea where I was. I felt around in the dark and felt nothing. Finally, I realized there actually was a faint blue light coming from above. I moved towards it, and then understood where I was. I was in the fucking basement. The light was coming through the basement door at the top of the stairs, which leads into the kitchen. Just enough moonlight apparently made it through from a window elsewhere in the kitchen. I bolted up the stairs, turned on the kitchen light, and closed the basement door. I was terrified until I calmed myself down enough to come to the conclusion you probably already came to. I had sleepwalked all the way down the stairs after opening the basement door, which I know was closed. A couple of things are important to this story. First, the basement. The house was very nice. Actually, more than they should have been able to afford. The only exception was the basement. I'd only seen the basement once when I'd first got the tour. It was totally unfinished, and was the one major thing they wanted to fix up. All they had down there were boxes and the washer-dryer. I had no reason to want to go down there, and had kind of forgotten it even existed. The other point is that sleepwalking is kind of a thing in my family, almost an inside joke. My brother talked in his sleep constantly, and would sleepwalk sometimes. It always scared the hell out of me. The idea of people doing things in their sleep just creeps me out to the core. Still does. My brother knew this and would tease me about it, so it was known in my family that I had this phobia. But as far as I know, I had never, ever sleepwalked until that night. The image kept playing in my mind over and over of me asleep, getting up from the couch, walking to the kitchen, opening up the basement door, and shuffling down the stairs in total darkness. Creepy as all hell. Anyway, I saw the TV was still on in the living room, playing The Wedding Crashers. I watched the rest of the movie, trying to laugh and think of the sleepwalking as a funny story to tell my brother. When I went upstairs to go to sleep in the guest room, I stayed asleep. That was night 1. The next morning, in the light of day, it didn't seem that scary. I texted my brother about it and joked around. All day, I wasn't bothered one bit, but as I'm walking out of my office to my car, I'm overcome by this sense of dread. All of a sudden, the thought of going to sleep in that house, and maybe sleepwalking again, is scaring the hell out of me. So I had a plan. I stop at the hardware store and pick up one of those rubber door stopper wedges. At the house, I jam this into the crack under the basement door and kick it until it's as far as it can go. I test it out, trying to open the door, and it won't budge. Perfect. Later, I go upstairs and fall asleep. When I wake up, I swear to God I think I'm dreaming. I was standing in darkness again, but this time I know exactly where I am. The smell is the same. The concrete floor under my feet is the same. I look around for the light from upstairs, and it takes me longer to find it because it's farther away. Last night I was only a couple of feet from the stairs. This night it was maybe 10 feet. I run up and turn on the kitchen lights. I see the rubber wedge on the floor, a couple of feet away, as if it was tossed there. Again, I can't stop picturing myself sleepwalking. Out of the bedroom, down the stairs, trying to open the basement door, bending down and yanking out the wedge, and then, again, slowly down into the darkness. I decided I was turning on the basement lights, and they were staying on. I opened the door and flipped the switch to the basement stairway. I saw there was a main switch at the bottom of the stairs. To give you a quick sense of the layout, the staircase splits the basement into 2 parts. To the right is a small area with the washer-dryer, and to the left is the big open area. I walked down and turned on the lights for the whole basement. That's when I noticed something I hadn't when my brother gave me the tour. About 10 to 15 feet away, in the big area, there was a door to what looked like a small closet. This door was closed, but had no doorknob, just an empty hole, so it looked like it would freely swing open. I realized it was very close to where I had just awoken. Then a fucking freaky thought came to me. It was as if each night I was heading to the door and getting a little farther each time before I woke up. As soon as that thought popped into my head, I booked it up the stairs again, left the lights on, and closed the door. I went up to the bedroom, but it took me forever to fall asleep. That was night 2. The next morning, Wednesday morning, I woke up late for work. I didn't think about the basement at all because I was scrambling to get ready. At work though, I was still curious about what was behind the door, so I texted my brother and asked. He replied, "Wait, why were you in the basement?" I realized that when I texted him the day before, I never actually told him where I woke up, so I tell him I woke up in the basement, actually twice in a row. After a while, he sends this novel-length text. It was about how the basement is creepy, and not to go down there, etc. How they tried putting the litter boxes in the basement, and the cats made a mess in the house because they refused to go down there. How he volunteers to do every chore other than the laundry, just so he doesn't have to go down there. He says all this stuff, and it's surprising to me, because my brother never believed in the paranormal or superstitions, not even when we were kids. I also realize he never answered my question about the door, but I let it go. After work, I get the same feeling of dread as I'm walking to my car. I really don't want to stay there again, and I decide, fuck it, I don't have to. So I go and feed the cats, get my stuff, and drive back to my place. I'm supposed to feed the cats one more time, so I'll stop over in the morning. As I went to sleep at my apartment, I was thinking of all the steps I'd have to take to sleepwalk to the basement again. Find my car parked around the block, drive asleep to my brother's house, etc. But this time, I sleep through the night. That was night 3. Thursday morning, I stop at the house as planned. I'm about to leave when I remember that the basement lights are still on. I don't even hesitate to go down there and turn them off. There was something about being there in the morning that, at the time, made it seem fine. When I go down, again, that door without a doorknob catches my eye, and it doesn't even seem scary anymore. So, what the hell, let's see. I walk over to it, and I distinctly remember not feeling spooked at all. That is, until I reach my hand towards the doorknob hole to pull it open. As soon as I do that, and I mean instantly, I feel this electric feeling, like the air before a storm, and I imagine a hand coming through the hole and grabbing mine. It was like 0 to 60, going from no fear to being certain something horrible would happen if I opened the door. It's hard to describe it other than that electric feeling. I booked it up the stairs and out of the house. So, a month later, I meet my brother for happy hour. A few drinks in, we start joking about me sleepwalking and the creepy basement. I say he never answered me about what was behind the door, and he says I don't want to know, joking at first, but then, as I persist, he gets more serious, insisting that I really don't want to know. Finally, he tells me, and I don't believe him. He's my big brother, and he's only bullshitted me 1,000,000 times in the past. This was his explanation. The previous and first owners of the house had a teen daughter that used the basement as her bedroom. The door was to her closet, where one night she curled up, took some pills, and killed herself. The family was going to remodel the basement, but after tearing it apart, realized they couldn't do it and had to move. That was why only the basement was unfinished, and why my brother was able to afford the place. The seller had to disclose a suicide happened in the residence. He said if I didn't believe him, to look up the market values of the identical houses in his tract. I know how much they paid for their house, and it was way lower. He and his wife considered themselves rational people, and figured it was a bargain, but they still didn't want to tell anyone. After they moved in, his wife was fine with the basement, but he grew to hate it. He apologized for not saying anything to me before I stayed there, but he never thought I'd have any reason to go down there. Now, here's what convinced me. I said, okay, the only thing that makes me kind of believe you is that last morning I was there, and I went over to the closet door. At this point, I see my brother's face change. I continued. When I went over to it, the air felt like, and at that same instant, I say, electricity, and my brother says, electric, at the same exact time. I saw his face and knew he was telling the truth. I've never stepped foot again in that basement, and I haven't sleepwalked since. In March of 2003, back when I was 17 years old, my younger brother and I took a weekend camping trip up to Los Padres National Forest. We'd gone there many times with our family for day camping, swimming, and just lounging around. This time though, we went alone for a 2-night camping trip at our favourite spot. It's a place that most locals simply refer to as the Gorge. We'll never forget that weekend, but for all the wrong reasons. We got there Saturday morning at around 9 AM and hiked the 5 miles out to the Gorge. The Gorge is a large swimming hole with a huge 60-foot rock cliff boulder that visitors love to jump from into the deep water below. The jumping rock cliff is very steep, and you have to jump in a very specific location to ensure that you don't hit the rocks protruding from the wall face. The Gorge has many primitive camping areas, and is overall a beautiful yet isolated place. The first day was very fun, and after a long day of swimming, catching crawdads, jumping from rocks, and just relaxing, we set up our tent, made a fire, and ate our cans of SpaghettiOs and a few crawdads we had cooked for dinner. Towards the end of our dinner, we were visited by a large group of students who were camping farther down the river. They stated that they were students from the Bay Area, and had a few nights left in their almost 2-week-long school camping trip. We offered them some of our chips and snacks, and chatted with them for a bit before they made their hike back to their camping spot. It soon got dark, and my brother and I got ready for bed. My brother was 2 years younger than me, and had a deep fear of isolation. So we slept in the same tent, and agreed that we'd keep our fire burning the entire night to ease his anxieties. We put 5 large logs on the fire, and crept inside our tent and got in our sleeping bags. We both fell asleep very fast, as we were exhausted from the day. Around 2:30 in the morning, we're both awoken by a large splash of water near our tent that puts out our fire. We heard no voices, and couldn't see much from inside our tent. We froze in terror. My brother began to cry, and I tried to calm him down. I told him I'd go outside and investigate, and that everything would be okay. Said our water bladder must have fallen from the tree where it was hung, and that I'm sure it's some kind of coincidence. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped our tent, and stepped outside. I pointed the flashlight over to the fire pit, and saw 4 large men sitting around our fireplace, all staring at me with what I can only describe as expressionless faces. It appeared as though they had slit open our 2-gallon water bladder and tossed it into our fire. I was in shock and didn't know what to say. For about 5 seconds, none of them said anything. We just stared at each other. Then, in a very drunk voice, one of them said, "Get your pussy friend out here too." I then heard my brother hyperventilating and screaming and crying in our tent in a way that made me feel so helpless. I had no weapons, and my brother and I were outnumbered 2 to 1. I asked the men what they wanted, and told them that we could just leave, and that we were sorry if we were taking their camping spot or invading their area. They ignored my questions, and just stood up. That's when I see that 2 of the 4 men were holding something in their hands. They were long, sword-shaped in appearance, like a machete or a short sword, but they looked homemade, primitive. The men yelled at us to get up, and to bring our pussy asses with them. I thought for a second that these might be drunken rangers, merely mad at us for having too big of a fire. But once I glanced at their clothing, and saw their baggy jeans and their black and grey hoodies, I knew we weren't so lucky. I had heard in the past that drug dealers and Mexican cartels had been caught hiding their marijuana plants in the forest, and wondered if these men were of a similar breed, and somehow felt like we were a threat to their crops. We were in fear for our lives. The men didn't touch us or directly threaten us with violence, but the threat was definitely implied in their tone, and I knew we didn't have any choice in the matter. We followed the lead male while the other 3 men fell back behind us. My brother put his hand on my shoulder and was visibly shaking. He then whispered to me that they were walking us in the direction of the 60-foot rock cliff, and that we needed to run. I was petrified and hadn't been paying attention to where they were leading us, but when he said it, I realized he was right. I stopped dead in my tracks and said to the men, "What are you gonna do to us?" The lead male said in a very slurred voice, "Nothing. We're just gonna have some fun with you pussies." I felt like we really had no choice but to do what they said, and hope that they were merely screwing with us, and that this would all be over soon. After about 30 seconds of walking, we arrived at the jumping spot on top of the boulder, overlooking the gorge swimming area. One of the men then asked, "Have you guys ever jumped from here?" I told them yes, I had, but my brother hadn't, as it was a pretty high jump, and was very dangerous for most people due to the height of the rocks below. The men laughed, and again called my brother a pussy. I told them we weren't pussies, but it just wasn't safe to do it in the dark. The men then formed a half circle around us, and one of them said, "I wanna see. Show us you're not a bunch of pussies." I screamed at them that it was too dangerous at night, and that during the day it was dangerous enough. I told them that there are many rocks down there that you have to avoid, and that if you don't jump precisely correctly, the jump will kill you. I pleaded and pleaded. The men just laughed and took a few steps closer to us. I was beyond scared, and could hear my heart beating through my ears. My brother, by this point, was crying loudly, and saying things I couldn't understand. He was beyond terrified, and so was I. I grabbed his hand and told him that we needed to get away from these men, and that we were in great danger. I told him I had jumped off the boulders into the water before, and knew where to jump, and that if he jumped with me, we'd be okay. I told him I'd use my flashlight to help guide us, and that I'd tell him where to put his feet and how far to jump. The men continued to laugh as we had our conversation, and showed zero humanity or pity. I held my brother's hand, and placed his feet onto a specific spot on the rock ledge, where I remembered jumping from last time I was there months before. I explained to him that I knew he was scared, and so was I, but that we needed to jump out as far as we possibly could, and slightly to the right, otherwise we'd hit the rocks. He was shaking, crying, and kept telling me that he couldn't do it. He then urinated on the floor. The men laughed and continued to berate us. I then told my brother we needed to jump now, and that he'd be okay if he listened to me. I told him that after we jumped, we'd swim to the shore on the right, and would hide in the bushes until daybreak, and go for help then. I then grabbed his hand tightly, and told him that once we hit the water, he needed to tuck his legs and arms in, so that they wouldn't get hurt from the impact of the water. I then instructed him that he needed to swim hard to the surface, as we'd sink pretty far down due to the height of the jump. I grabbed his hand, and we jumped. I pulled him hard with me to ensure that he'd be safe from the rocks below. We fell for what felt like a minute, but in reality was only a few seconds. My brother yelled all the way down in a way I've never heard another human being scream before. Terror, dread, and fear of imminent death reverberated from his voice. I felt helpless and almost forgot where we were for those few seconds. Then we hit the water. As soon as we hit, I lost my grip on my brother's hand, but I did hear a second impact in the water. I swam up towards the surface with all of my energy and took a deep breath. I then listened for my brother to surface, and heard nothing. I panicked and dove down into the water to try and grab him. Just as I dove, I felt his leg brush against my hand and realized he was about to surface. I swam up again and heard my brother. He was crying and kept saying that his arm had hit a rock on the way down and that he couldn't feel it. The men above were laughing again, and I heard one of them say, "They actually fucking made it. Those pussies." I then heard objects splashing in the water around us, and realized that they were throwing beer bottles or rocks or some other hard objects at us. I quickly grabbed my brother by his shirt and helped him swim to the nearby shore. The whole time we swam, tons of objects landed dangerously close to us, and I remember thinking, if any of these hit us on the head, it's gonna kill us. I'd lost my flashlight during the fall, and we were in complete darkness. We reached the water's edge, and I pulled my brother to the shore. Objects continued to rain down around us, and we could hear the men yelling and laughing. I told my brother that we needed to run. He was crying, and he was holding his injured arm, which he still couldn't feel or use. It had a deep cut around the elbow, and even with just the starlight, we could see it was a serious injury. We stumbled down the tree line and began making our way through the darkness to one of the main trails, using only my memory as a guide. We fell again and again, and were cut by branches and rocks all over our bodies as we wandered about down the overgrown trail. Everything in my body told me to keep going and to get as far away from these men as we could. We walked for many minutes until we could no longer hear the men, and then we waited. I wrapped my brother's arm with my shirt and told him it was all over and that all we had to do now was wait until morning for help. We sat in that spot all night, and my brother cried and shook for hours. I just put my arm around him and patted his head, just like when we were children and he had a panic attack and our parents weren't around. At daybreak, we finally see the severity of his injuries. He had a deep gash in his arm, and his shoulder was obviously dislocated. I helped him hike up the nearby trail, and we walked all the way back to the base camp ranger station. We explained what had happened to the rangers, and they sent 2 armed officers to go and investigate the location. My brother was sent to a nearby hospital for treatment, and I joined him in the ambulance ride over. The rangers never found the men, but did retrieve most of our gear. The scary thing about this incident is that same week, 2 teenage boys were found dead at the bottom of the gorge jumping area. They had been a part of the school trip group we had met earlier. Their camping ground had been invaded by a group of people with similar machete-like objects who chased them off their camping spot. I'm glad to be alive, and my brother and I have never gone camping alone again, nor have we been back to the gorge. All we have left from the incident are the scars on my brother's arm, hospital bills, and a lot of trauma. An article about the death of the 2 teenage boys can be found in the description below. I can only hope that their deaths were accidents like the authorities ruled. I didn't find out about their deaths until 7 years later, but was horrified by the similar circumstances and the timing of the 2 events. When I was 14, our family dog, a German Shepherd named Benny, went missing. My older brother and I had taken him out for a walk in the Arizonan woods that surround our house. The dog disappeared out of eyeshot and didn't return when we called for him. Must have looked for a solid 3 hours before the sun started to set, and we had to jog back to our house. We told our dad that Benny had disappeared on our usual walking trail. Well, old Benny was part of the family, so my dad and uncle went out with a couple of flashlights in search of him, reassuring my brother and I that they'd find him. Despite their reassurances, I honestly didn't hold out much hope. We live in the middle of nowhere, with vast woodland almost surrounding the house. Even though Benny knew this area like the back of his paw, if he'd wandered too far out in those woods, he could have easily lost his bearings. It's possible he caught sight of a critter and chased it too deep in. I was distressed, of course, because I loved that dog like a brother, and so did, well, my brother. We waited alone in the house for a couple more hours, anxiously awaiting our elder's return. It was a fair trek down to where we'd lost sight of him, but every minute we had to wait was disheartening. You can imagine my jubilation when I heard a dog's bark coming from the surrounding woods. My first assumption was that our uncle and dad had found him, but when I peered out of my bedroom window overlooking the front, I saw nothing. Our family members weren't anywhere to be seen. Had Benny found his way back by himself? Did I just imagine that barking? I called my brother over, telling him I just heard what must have been Benny out by the trees. As he stared out of the window beside me, a second bark rang out, much louder than the first. Actually, a little too loud. Being a German Shepherd, Benny had a strong bark, but this seemed almost unnatural, and almost seemed to reverberate. The tree line where it was coming from was a fair distance from the house, but it sounded like he was just outside the window. After an interval of a few seconds, another identical bark. It might sound odd to say this, since dog barks sound pretty alike, but it was almost too similar to the last one. There was a static quality to it, almost like an old recording. Then came a whimpering, like an injured dog would make. I knew that my brother thought this was strange as well, as he shot me an unnerved look, and told me to stay put whilst he went out with my dad's rifle to investigate. If Benny was hurt out there, we'd have to help him pronto. I kept a watchful eye and ear from my bedroom, and my brother ventured outside, cautiously approaching the tree line. About 10 meters away, I saw him freeze on the spot, shining his flashlight at a specific point in the woods. He lowered it, and aimed his rifle at the same spot. All this time, I'm hollering at him from my bedroom window, asking what the hell's going on. He doesn't answer me, just stands there for the longest moment. Then he pulls a 180 and hightails it back inside. I ask him what the hell that was all about. He says that as he got close to the tree line, he saw old Benny all right, tail wagging and everything. Gave him a little, "Come here, boy." The dog wouldn't budge. It wanted my brother to go to him. When my brother shone his flashlight on Benny, he knew something wasn't right with the big guy. Aside from his moving tail, he was standing stiff and rigid, and looked more like a taxidermy statue. His sides didn't even expand or contract to breathe. And his eyes, they weren't dog-like. He said it was more like looking into the eyes of a human stranger. They were large, wide, and full of white. That might be difficult to picture, but he said you wouldn't have to know what Benny looked like to know this was unnatural for a dog. That's when he raised his rifle, and the damn thing stood up on its back legs and sprinted off deep into the woods, running just like a man. Since it looked like Benny, he couldn't take the shot. He claims to this day that the thing was trying to lure us out into those woods, projecting its voice and trying to catch us off guard, that it hadn't yet learned the little nuances of acting like an authentic dog. Our dad and uncle returned home about 15 minutes later. They'd found Benny's mauled body by a lake a couple of miles out. They said he must have been there for hours. I personally don't know who did this, but my grandma does. Back in the 70s, they had a family party. This guy put rat poison in a Coke bottle, back when they had those releasable metal caps. Then he left it in the fridge with the rest of the Cokes for whichever unlucky family member would drink it. My uncle was maybe 7 at the time, and he snuck it. The kids weren't allowed soda, so maybe whoever poisoned the cola didn't think a kid would end up with it. It ended up killing my uncle. My grandma lied about it, and I was always told some kid at school did it. My dad or his sister could have just as easily been the victims themselves, but they were too scared to drink the cola, fearing they'd get in trouble if their parents caught them. For years, I was convinced they might have been connected with the mob, since my family is Italian. That's just a hunch though. I think it was more of an arsehole way of playing Russian roulette with Coke. Nothing ever came of it, and despite the fact it was her own son who died, my grandma never revealed the killer. Why that might be, I don't know. I'm assuming more than one person knows, but since she didn't do anything about it, no one said or did anything. This happened about 2 years ago when I was 19. My girlfriend, friends and I were travelling from London to Bangkok and had booked a cheap place to stay on Airbnb. It was situated down this creepy little alley that had no lights. It was a tight squeeze too, only about the width of one person. Eventually we get our act together and head down in single file, and come to this really shoddy looking building. No, this can't be the place. We thought we'd booked an established house online, but this place was a shithole. It was small, run down, and shadier than Slim himself. But hey, it was super cheap, and we were all really tired from travelling, so we thought, screw it, we can put up with this for a few nights. The dude hosting us is there, waiting, and he's this creepy little guy. He offered us a few bottles of Coca-Cola, but the bottles were really dirty. It looked like they'd been used before, like they'd been left in the trash and refilled. We politely declined. There was something evidently wrong about this guy. He was this short little dude with a crooked smile, and a hunched over back as well. Sort of reminded me of a jockey from Left 4 Dead, if I'm honest. But it wasn't his appearance that made me wary. It was the way he was acting around the girls in our group, getting a little too close for comfort. He was thirsty for something other than dirty cola, I'll tell you that much. After a few choice glares, he leaves the keys with us and goes on his merry way, allowing us to enjoy our stay in peace. All of the double bedrooms were next door to one another. The rooms were tiny, and the air conditioning unit kept dripping on me during the night, but otherwise they were somewhat acceptable. So the next morning rolls around, and we all go to check out the sights. Around midday, I started getting some serious stomach problems, so decided to go back to the hotel with one of my friends, Helena. She'd been having trouble sleeping for a while, and wanted to try and get some rest. The two of us got back to the house. Helena's room was the one next to mine. She gave me a hug and went to take her nap. I spent about half an hour mucking around on my laptop when I decided to take a shower. Now, the bathroom in my room was ridiculously small, and I'm a 6'2" guy, so there was barely any room to move. It had a shower, a toilet, and a sink, all somehow squeezed inside. A claustrophobic's nightmare. There was also a little glazed window that didn't open. So I have my shower, and everything's hunky-dory. When I finish, I go to open the door, but it won't open. The door was somehow broken and jammed shut. I try for a good long while to open it, but it won't budge at all. I start banging on the wall, knowing that my friend is on the other side and should be able to hear me. But she doesn't. I bang even louder, and still nothing. These walls weren't thick, so I was confused as to why she couldn't hear me. I would have obviously have called my friends on my mobile, but all of my stuff was in the bedroom. About 30 minutes go by. Since there's no ventilation in the room, I'm feeling a little lightheaded from all of the steam from the hot shower. I tried to open up that shitty little window, but just like the door, it's sealed tighter than a bull's arsehole in fly season. All this time, I've been trying to get Helena's attention. About 2 hours in, I hear someone enter the room. Thank God, I think. She's finally heard me. I yell through the door and tell her to try and open it from the other side, but there's no response. Instead, I hear squeaking, like somebody's bouncing on the bed. Then I hear laughter, but it's not Helena. It's a man's voice. Who the hell's there? I shout, seriously hoping one of my friends had come back and was messing with me or something. The laughter stopped abruptly, and a man responded to me in Thai. I have no idea what he said, but from the tone of his voice, I knew it was something threatening. The laughter resumes immediately after he says this. Now, I don't know if this guy has a weapon, or even what he wants. If he was going to rob me, all of my stuff was already there for the taking. Why was he sticking around and laughing? This goes on for what must have been 10 minutes. And then, suddenly, dead silence. Had he left? It begins to dawn on me the reason Helena might not have been responding. I start trying to break down the door, but it's surprisingly sturdy, and despite my size, I'm far from athletic. Only a minute passes, and all of my friends return from sightseeing. I yell to my friend Ross to get me out. He tries to open it, but eventually it becomes clear the only way I'm getting out is by smashing down that door. So that's what we do. When I'm out, everybody's there, including Helena. Turns out she had just taken some sleeping pills and had fallen into such a deep sleep that she couldn't even hear my banging for help. I was extremely relieved to see she was okay. Absolutely nothing was missing from my room. To me, the culprit was pretty obvious. Our pervy jockey host. I suspect he must have fled when he heard my friends coming back. The others didn't see anyone. Needless to say, we all got the hell out of there and took up in a hotel for the rest of the trip. When I next went online to warn others in a review, The listing on Airbnb had mysteriously disappeared. To this day, I wonder whether the host had somehow planned for that door to jam, like some sort of trap. I also wonder what would have happened if my girlfriend had returned instead of me, or if he had simply realized Helena was alone in the other room. I was 16 years old when this happened, and still at school in Osaka. While there, one particular classmate of mine always caught my attention. A beautiful girl with chocolate-colored hair and big, bright eyes. Her name was Suzumi. Not only was she really good-looking, but she was kind and smart too. A triple whammy. Needless to say, I had the biggest of crushes on her. Problem was, I could never muster up the courage to ask her out, since there were always a bunch of other guys swooning around her, desperately peacocking for her attention. Now, I wasn't an ugly guy per se, but I wasn't exactly a stud either. So, you can imagine my surprise when she sat beside me one lunchtime and asked if I wanted to go to the beach with her on the weekend. Like, an actual date. I couldn't believe my luck. There was no way I was gonna say no to that. It was a dream come true when we finally made our relationship official. For a while, everything was great. But as the weeks went by, a different side of her started to rise to the surface. She didn't like me hanging around with my best friend. He was another guy, a gay guy called Jiro. For whatever reason, she thought he had a crush on me. I assured her that wasn't the case at all. Jiro and I had been best buds since we were small kids, and we thought of each other like brothers. Besides that, I wasn't that way inclined in the slightest. I made all of this very clear, and told her how much I loved her, and to stop overanalyzing things. The mid-semester break rolled around, and Suzume started becoming extremely possessive. Jiro's parents were out of the country on an extended holiday, so our whole group of friends used his house as a sort of hangout pad. Occasionally, a girl or two would join us too. Suzumi hated that I went to these events. She was irked by the fact I wouldn't spend every waking moment with her, and couldn't understand why I might want to just chill with my friends occasionally. If the focus wasn't 100% on her, then her sweet and innocent demeanor would melt away, and she'd turn vicious and spiteful. She would even start to get mad when I paid my cat attention instead of her. This was starting to get out of hand, and honestly, Suzumi was starting to become more of a hassle than she was worth. I told Jiro and the guys about it, and they all suggested I cut things off with her. It took a little longer for that to fully sink in. This was my first girlfriend after all, and she was really hot, but nobody should have to put up with this sort of crap. As the days progressed, her neediness turned sinister. She started breaking my things to get her own way, threatened to cut herself if I wanted to see my friends. I'd sometimes even catch her following me around town when we hadn't made plans to see each other, staring at me from afar, and not even coming over to say hi. I'd call out to her, but she'd remain expressionless. Then she'd walk away and disappear into the crowd. It no longer felt like I had a girlfriend, but a stalker. I'd never been in a relationship before, but I knew this wasn't normal behavior. The final straw came when I caught her slamming my cat's tail in the door. She claimed it was unintentional, but I knew otherwise. I saw the way she eyed the poor thing before pushing the door as forcefully as she could, probably hoping to do more damage than she did. She was jealous of a cat. I ended things right then and there, and told her to get the hell out of my house. There were some tears, but thankfully she left without much resistance. I took my cat to the vet's, and he ended up having to have his tail amputated. I had kept Suzumi's craziness a secret from my family for the whole time we dated, and decided to keep things that way. I guess I felt sorry for her. I just said that I had accidentally stepped on the cat's tail. After that, I didn't see Suzumi again for the rest of the break. That didn't stop her from constantly messaging me on social media sites and by text. Her messages were mostly pleas for forgiveness. Others were the complete opposite, telling me how she'd make me see the error of my ways and how I'd regret leaving her. They were the ravings of a lunatic. I ignored each one. The mid-semester break came to an end, and I was sort of nervous about how things would go on the first day back at school. Suzume was a lot more popular than I was. Was she going to start spreading gossip, painting me as the bad guy? I had no idea. Whatever the case, my small group of friends and I knew the truth. That underneath Suzume's perfect exterior, there was a stone-cold bitch, nuts beyond belief. I sat there in class on that Monday morning, hoping that Jiro would come in before Suzumi. One by one, people started to enter, but 2 desks remained empty. There was no sign of either Suzumi or Jiro. On top of that, Jiro wasn't responding to my calls or texts. That wasn't like him. Well, perhaps he had an early morning dentist's appointment or something. No. The whole day, Jiro was absent from school, and I couldn't get a hold of him. My suspicion got the better of me, and that evening, I decided to visit his house. When I arrived, his house was surrounded by police tape. 2 police cars were outside, and a couple of officers were standing by the front door. I asked them what the hell was going on, but was told that it was a private matter. I told them that the kid who lived inside was a close friend of mine, and demanded an answer. They kept silent, and one of them told me to go home, said that I shouldn't stick around. Well, I was a stubborn young man, and so as long as I kept my distance from the property, there wasn't anything they could do to get rid of me. From inside the house, I could hear the occasional female scream, like a wailing sound. I couldn't work out if they were angry, or scared, or heartbroken. Regardless, each time one rang out, my heart sank in my chest. What on earth was going on inside? Had Jiro's parents come home early, and some sort of domestic incident taken place? Had there been an accident? I waited until 2 cops came out, dragging a chocolate-haired girl by her arms, her hands cuffed. She struggled and screamed before looking up for a means of escape. That's when her eyes met mine. Suzumi. Her bright eyes that I had once fallen for had turned dull. They began to water. She dropped her head in shame, avoiding my stare. Without even thinking, I ran up to her, desperate to find out what was going on. I was pushed aside by one of the cops as they forced her into the squad car. "I'll be back soon. Don't think about running off with a slut, or she'll die too," she said quietly, as if only I could hear it. As if what she had just said was completely normal and everyday. Before I could respond, the car door was slammed shut. An ambulance arrived not long after. 2 medics rushed inside the house. I remained in the same spot, refusing to move. I wish that I had. Rolled out on a board, pale-faced and with dead eyes, was Jiro. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. Another officer inside had been working on saving his life, but it was no use. Suzumi had been holding him hostage in his own home. She got the idea that Jiro was behind our breakup, and not her own crazy actions. Marks on Jiro's body suggested that he had been bound and tortured. When a female friend of his dropped by and saw what was going on, she ran for her life and called the cops. Rather than leave things there and surrender herself to the police, Suzume decided to finish the job. It took them so long to get her out of the house because she was threatening to kill herself too. My biggest regret is not telling people what had happened when she broke my cat's tail. Remorselessly hurting animals is a warning sign of a psychopath. As of right now, Suzume is behind bars. She managed to escape the death penalty because of her age, and the fact that there was only one victim. She'll probably only spend around 15 more years in prison before getting out on parole. If she ever does fulfill her promise, if she ever does come back for me, I'll kill her myself. This took place in my home country, on a family farm in the great outdoors. I have an aunt on my father's side of the family. She was childless, even after 10+ years of marriage, and this bothered her greatly. On top of that, she and her husband were always curt towards one another. So, after a while, it became a sort of open secret in my family that my uncle had a girl on his farm, a mistress who he had been seeing behind my aunt's back. This mistress was a lower caste farm worker and his keep. They would stay at her hut, and eventually had a baby daughter together. They were able to keep the child a secret for 2 years before my aunt found out. Now, my aunt was always a bit unhinged, so when she heard the news that her husband had decided to marry the young farmhand and give their daughter his official name, she went crazy. She hired professional hitmen called Ramoshis and told them to break into the young girl's hut at night and kill everyone there. Well, Ramoshis don't kill children, so to finish the job, she turned up at the site, and while the Ramoshis killed the girl, her younger sister, her mother, and her father, my aunt strangled the 2-year-old child in her sleep. Somehow, someone saw the Ramoshis running away from the crime scene, and were able to identify my aunt with them. After a prolonged court hearing, in which my family lost most of their resources, my aunt was found guilty, and was given a life sentence. This was over 25 years ago now, back when my mother was pregnant with me. I'd never even seen this aunt in my entire life. However, I've always been told how much I look like her. She was one of the most good-looking women in our family, so I guess people say it as a compliment. She'll be out of jail in September of this year. She's been told that one of her nieces looks just like her, and apparently she's very interested in meeting me. Fuck my life. I've always had really intense, vivid dreams ever since I was a kid. At least once every week, I wake up and remember pretty much everything I dreamt during the night. The scenarios in the dreams vary, but there's a few recurring ones. Some pleasant, some less so. But one thing that links a lot of them together is this one character who frequently appears. I have no idea who he is, but I can picture his face in my head as if he were my own brother. He's always been the same age as me. When I was a kid, so was he, and now that I'm 28, he's a grown man in my dreams too. It's unmistakably the same guy every time. Tan skin, shaggy, unkempt hair, piercing eyes. I read somewhere online that your mind can't make up new faces by itself while you're asleep. You have to have actually seen the person in the flesh at some point, maybe just passed them in the street. Anyway, 2 weeks ago, I was out of state at a gas station. While I'm inside waiting to pay, some guy busts in with a gun in his hand, screaming at the clerk to open up the register and threatening to blow our fucking heads off. I'm backing away with my hands in full view, terrified out of my mind. The clerk is shakily pulling the cash out for the guy. The robber glances at my face and does a double take. Now, staring at me, the colour almost seems to drain away from his face. I knew what was going through his head. It was the same thing that was going through mine. Recognition and confusion. This was unmistakably him. That guy I'd been dreaming about for years. My partner in crime from my dreams. He brings the gun up and aims it at me. And in that moment, I knew I was fucking finished. I just knew it. He holds the gun there, then brings it back down to his side. The same shocked expression stuck on his face. He takes what's on the side already and doesn't bother demanding any more. He just quick steps out of there. I have no idea what that was all about, though I've been racking my brain since the incident. How the hell did we both know each other? Did the two of us meet in our past lives? Will we meet again? Is this just some freaky coincidence and I'm reading too much into it? I literally have no idea. I'm just thankful I hadn't been dreaming about the face of my future killer for all those years. The guy was caught on the station's CCTV. They're still out looking for him. I lived in Menifee, California, for about over 3 years. During that time, I went to the local high school, and let me just say that a lot of crazy stuff went down while I attended. One time, a library employee showed up to school very early in the morning and shot herself in her car. The body was discovered during second period. What creeps me out most of all was that I passed by her car while I was walking to school that morning and didn't even notice it. Another time, an undercover cop posing as a student was able to identify kids that were selling narcotics, and shortly after, a huge drug bust ensued. Strangely enough, on the same day that happened, while I was walking to school, some guy I knew asked if I wanted to buy pot off him, which I wisely declined. Later on, I saw that same guy get arrested and escorted out of my classroom. If you've ever seen 21 Jump Street, the event itself closely mirrored that. Pretty awesome. However, the one event that was probably the biggest and shook the entire community was the disappearance and death of a local boy named Terry Dwayne Smith Jr. The tragedy happened during the summer after the 2013 school year. I didn't know who the boy was, but I did know his older brother, Skylar. I knew Skylar from school. He was in my first period English class at the time. I didn't talk to him much, even though he sat near me, but on the times that I did say a word to him, he was friendly. He came off as a little bit odd, but I personally didn't think he was really that strange. He had his own group of friends who were really easy to get along with. Something of note that did happen early on in the school year was a confrontation he got in. I remember hearing about how this one guy said something offensive to Skylar, which in turn greatly angered him, and it all erupted into a fight. The kid's front tooth got knocked out. At the time, it seemed funny to everyone else, but it was an indicator of how far Skylar was willing to go when it came to getting agitated. Anyways, on to the main story. After school ended that year, I spent most of the summer just hanging out with my trio of friends. One day, I was in my room doing nothing of interest, so I decided to go on Facebook. While on there, Skylar posted something that appeared on my newsfeed. He said his little brother had gone missing and was urging his friends to be on the lookout for his whereabouts. I found it pretty unfortunate, but thought the kid would probably be found the same day. Either that day or the next, I forget which, I happened to be watching the news, and the number one topic was the disappearance of a boy named Terry. A picture of him was then put up. On closer examination, I noticed he was the same boy that Skylar had posted about earlier. Apparently, the situation had gotten dire, and the brother's mother, Shauna, had called for a group effort to go and search for the boy. As the days went on, more and more people went out in search of young Terry. I believe Skylar made a few more posts about it, but I could be wrong. Eventually, he was made a suspect and was taken into custody by the police because he was the last person to see Terry alive before he went missing. I remember hearing about how a lot of his friends were in denial and disbelief. To them, he could never do such a thing. Since I personally didn't know Skylar that well, I couldn't really pass judgment at the time. While in custody, Skylar changed his story several times about his last encounter with his brother, his main one being that they were both home alone, and he decided to leave and go and hang out with his friends, and that supposedly Terry had followed him for a while, until Skylar told him he couldn't tag along and ordered him to return home. This set up his theory that Terry was probably abducted by someone that night. Finally, after several days of searching, Terry's body was eventually discovered behind the family home, under a tree in a shallow grave. The general consensus at the time was that Skylar did kill his brother for unknown reasons, and tried to bury him. Some even thought that the mother was in on it, because she was still in defense of Skylar, who was then charged with the crime. Shauna acted pretty strangely, saying that Terry had autism, and that supposedly at first she didn't let the cops investigate her property. After the corpse was discovered, the huge search party was promptly called off, and a candlelight vigil was held for Terry. In the aftermath, a lot of drama ensued. Terry's father came into town from the other side of the country and claimed that his ex-wife had lied about their son having autism and demanded to take his body back with him to be buried in his local area. He even sued Shauna for a large amount of money. I think it was for child negligence or for emotional distress. The two even appeared and debated on the Dr. Phil show, but nothing came out of that besides what everyone already knew. Since at the time Skylar was a minor, he wasn't charged as an adult. He was found guilty of manslaughter, but was offered a plea deal, the details of which have not been released to the public. Apparently, what actually happened was that the brothers were roughhousing when Terry was accidentally killed. Their mother later suggested something like the boy hitting his head on the corner of a table. In a panic, Skylar tried to bury him in the backyard. What was strange was that knowing what had happened, Skylar still went to Facebook and asked for help in searching for his brother instead of just confessing. Skylar was sentenced to 12 years and will still be in juvenile detention until he's 23. Overall, this was pretty tragic, and it's crazy how one day I was just talking to this guy in class, and the next he's on the news for his own brother's murder. Links to the case can be found in the description below. I've been a long-time stalker of this page, and I have a story of my own that still haunts me to this day. Let me set the scene for you. I was 7 years old, currently 25, and my mother was dating a man who had a daughter who was around 15. Her name was Christy. While she didn't live with us, she did stay with us some weekends. The reason this is important will come into play a little later. I grew up in a moderately isolated area in the south. My mother's house is on about 90 acres, most of it being heavily wooded. For the most part, it was quiet, the type of place most people don't even lock their doors, and everyone knows each other. It was quiet, until one sequence of events shook my community to its core. There was a man, just 2 streets over from mine, who murdered his girlfriend and her entire family in their home over a dinner, just 2 weeks before this event took place. It was also learned later that he had also murdered his mother and father in their home, as they were found after his girlfriend's family was. He hadn't been caught, and the local police had been working with cops in Tennessee, as there had been reports of people sighting him there. My mother had gotten a security system installed, just to ensure our home was properly secured. We had alarms on every window and door in our house. On this Saturday, my mother got called into work, as she was an apartment manager, and there was an emergency she needed to tend to. Her boyfriend had gone to work early that morning. Now, my mother was very, very nervous about leaving, and due to the nature of the emergency, she thought it was best that Christy and I stayed at home where we were safe. Safe, so she thought. She reluctantly left, and let us know that her cell phone was always going to be on if we needed her. Christy and I promptly set the alarms and made sure all of the windows and doors were locked. My mother had been gone about an hour, and we were deep into a movie on Disney, eating pizza. Suddenly, the alarm started blaring. Christy and I jumped up to see what was going on. On the way to the alarm, you have to pass a very large, sliding glass door. What we saw there left us frozen. There was a man prying our door open with a crowbar. He saw us, made eye contact, and quickly ran off into the woods behind my mother's house. I'll never forget what he looked like, or the sinister look he had in his eyes. We called the police, and then we called my mother, who had already been alerted by the alarm company. My mother actually arrived before the police did, due to how isolated we really were. When we described the man to the police, they immediately knew this was the man they were looking for. Of course, there was a massive investigation that day of the property and the woods that surrounded us. In the woods, they found cigarette butts, lots of canned food, soda bottles, and a makeshift tent made from a tarp. The man had been living behind us the entire time, and even stealing food from our trash. When he was arrested, which was a few hours after the incident, he had admitted to watching our family to learn our habits, knowing that he could take advantage of the house when no one was there. Even now, as an adult, this event still follows me. Just goes to show, you never really know who's watching you. Not much is known about skinwalkers, other than the obvious, since the Navajo generally don't like to talk about them. It's said that even discussing the creatures attracts their attention, though I think their reluctance has more to do with not letting outsiders in on their native lore. Watching you. Not much is known about skinwalkers, other than the obvious, since the Navajo generally don't like to talk about them. It's said that even discussing the creatures attracts their attention, though I think their reluctance has more to do with not letting outsiders in on their native lore. That being said, a part Navajo friend of mine has filled me in on some of the stories he's heard about the creatures, and quite frankly, they're pretty chilling. He's mostly apathetic when it comes to the whole native secrecy deal. He told us a story that happened to his uncle when he was only 21 and out on a camping trip with a few buddies of his. It was an annual trip they made to honor a friend of theirs who died young a couple of years prior. For the sake of this story, we'll say the friend's name was Jeremy. The rest of the guys had ventured out to those woods every year. Even with Jeremy having passed away, they kept the tradition very much alive. It was early one morning during the trip, and my friend's uncle had woken up before his buddies. He got out of the tent to take a little stroll around the area, stretch his legs, and appreciate the beautiful nature that surrounded him. He walks for about 5 minutes, and other than his friends, he's miles away from the closest human beings around. He's hearing nothing but birdsong and the breeze. But the calm atmosphere suddenly shifts, and the air around him started to feel heavy. The sound of the birds around him seemed to dissipate, and things became eerily and unusually silent. A strange sense of dread overcame him, and compelled him to turn around. There, standing on a raised area, was Jeremy. More accurately, it was Jeremy's face, seemingly superimposed on a weird, crooked body. He just stood there, waving at him. Looking at Jeremy's face closely, his jaw was slack, and his eyes were colorless and glazed over, like there was a thin, translucent film covering them. His expression never changed. His limbs were torn and bloody. My friend's uncle sprinted back to the tent and alerted the others. They knew the stories of skinwalkers, and wasted no time in packing up and cutting their trip short. Now, some people might be compelled to think that this was Jeremy's spirit, coming to hang out with his old camping buddies one last time. My friend's uncle knows otherwise. He says this was a malevolent entity. It was likely native to the area and had seen the boys on a previous trip. That's how it knew to take Jeremy's face. Finding love in Japan can be tough these days. The media here says that more and more young people are suffering from Sekusu Shinai Shokugan. That pretty much translates into celibacy syndrome. Basically, no one's getting laid anymore. Half of all young people aren't in a relationship, and they pretty much all plan on staying that way. They just seem to find the whole thing bothersome. A year ago, I considered myself to be in the other half. I was a relatively attractive 24-year-old guy with a decent job. At the risk of sounding cocky, I thought I had a lot going for me, so it frustrated me that I hadn't had a girlfriend since high school. Trust me, that wasn't from lack of trying. There's a number of services in my country designed to fill this romantic void. You can hire yourself a girlfriend who'll walk around holding your hand in public, or you can even go to a cuddle cafe where you can pay a girl to just lay beside you and, like the name suggests, cuddle you. Nintendo even makes virtual girlfriend games. Oh, the wonders of technology. These solutions weren't for me though. I wanted the real deal, a proper relationship. A co-worker of mine, Goro, told me about this speed dating night that was coming up. Said that he was going, and that I should sign up too. Well, it sounded like it could be a fun time. And what did I really have to lose? For those of you who don't know how a speed dating night works, here's a quick rundown. A bunch of single men and women turn up to the event. All the women go and sit at a table by themselves, and all of the men get told which one to sit with. Then a 3-minute timer starts. In that time, you either have a nice chat, or you sit there in awkward silence. Hopefully not the latter. Once time's up, a bell rings, and you move on to the next girl's table. Once everybody's had a 3-minute date with all of the other members of the opposite sex, you all mark down on a piece of paper who you'd be interested in seeing again. At the end, some matches are made. Some will get lucky, and some not so much. It was the night of the event, and to be honest, I was feeling pretty confident. I put on my best clothes, sprayed on some cologne, and practiced a few lines in the mirror before setting out. Good guy Goro came by and gave me a ride. Not only were we co-workers, but we had been friends since high school as well. Goro loved chasing after the girls at the clubs and bars, but always had limited success. Unfortunately for Goro, he was on the shorter and chubbier side. Imagine a Japanese Danny DeVito. I hoped the night would go well for him. The speed dating gets underway, and to start with, things are going great. It's about halfway through the night, and there haven't been any uncomfortable silences or anything. There was Akane, the bubbly young Tokyo girl who had moved here for work. Honoka, this hot intelligent chick with a great body. Yumi, this more alternative girl with bleach blonde hair, pale skin, and a really cute smile. And then I got to Kyoko. As I sat down, I thought there was something strangely familiar about her, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. She was pretty average looking, so maybe she just reminded me of someone else I knew. Hey, how's it going? I'm Shin.
I know. I'm Kyoko. Nice to meet you.
I know. Well, I did have a name tag on, but that was still pretty weird. Other than that, things started well enough, with her doing most of the talking. Well, all of the talking really. She spoke so fast and incoherently, it made listening to it all almost impossible. One thing did stand out though.
How's working at Takata anyway? It must be interesting. Oh my god, have you ever seen Nuburos? They do great seafood there.
Wait, what the hell? Takata? How did she know what company I worked for? Had I let that slip somehow? Goro was yet to see this girl, so there's no way he could have mentioned it. I would have asked her if she'd given me time to respond, but she just moved on to more incessant talking. I sat there politely, until the 3-minute timer released me from that purgatory. I stood up, said my nice to meet yous, and moved on to the next table. I did a lot worse the rest of that evening, distracted by the fact that Kyoko girl kept staring at me, like this unblinking, penetrating stare. Once all of the dates were over, I met back up with Goro. Hey bro, did you recognize her? Huh? I didn't know what he was talking about. That girl, Kyoko, from our high school. Man, I can't believe how much she's changed. Kyoko. I honestly couldn't place her in my head. The name rang a bell, sure, but Kyoko is common, and our school was pretty big. She must have really changed. I guess that's why I thought she seemed familiar, though. Mystery solved. Goro continued. Yeah man, she's really blossomed. She wasn't really into me though. Pff, what a jib. So Kyoko knew me from school, huh? Maybe I had her on Facebook and had forgotten all about her. That could explain how she knew where I worked. But if that's the case, why wouldn't she have mentioned knowing me from school? Ah well, she wasn't really my thing anyway. I marked her down as a non-match on my card and forgot all about it. Put it down to being one of those weird things, and figured I'd never see her again. Goro might not have been so lucky at the event, but I ended up getting a few matches, and actually went on a few more dates with some of the girls. Of all of them, I got along with Yumi the best. She was the one with dyed blonde hair. Pretty unusual for a Japanese chick, but she could pull it off really well. On our third date, we're eating dinner in a restaurant together. We'd just finished our main course, and were laughing and slightly drunk on sake, when I noticed one of the other diners on a far table from us. They were half hiding behind a menu. It was that Kyoko girl, sitting by herself and staring over at us, doing her best to remain unseen. I mentioned it to Yumi, who subtly glanced over to look at her. Well, she confirmed it definitely was the same Kyoko girl from the speed dating night, and made a joke about how she was probably following us around town. It was funny at first, but by the time our desserts came out, she was still just sitting there, totally alone, staring at us from behind her menu. Okay, either she was really indecisive about what she wanted to eat, or she's keeping a watch on us for some reason. I decided to go over and say something to her, but as I stood up to do so, she leapt up and ran out of the restaurant. That was unexpected. Still, the night went on. Yumi came back to my place for some coffee, and ended up staying the night. I was really starting to fall for this girl. Coffee started becoming a regular occurrence, and it wasn't long before Yumi and I made our relationship official. The whole speed dating thing had actually paid off. No virtual girlfriends for me, thank God. One evening, Goro called me up and asked Yumi and I on a double date sort of thing. Said that one of the girls from the speed dating night was interested in him after all, and had suggested going to see a movie at the cinema. Some corny rom-com. Well, I wanted to help a brother out, so I agreed. When we arrived, Goro was standing there with, you guessed it, Kyoko. Hey bro, check it out. Our blast from the past, huh? Goro said, taking me to one side. Bet you never saw this one coming, huh? Me bagging a hot babe like this? I guess Goro thought he'd surprise me with his date being Kyoko. Well, I was certainly surprised. Neither Yumi or I knew what to say. We kinda just stood there, awkwardly. Kyoko smiled at me.
Good to see you again, Shin.
Yeah. Hey. She would not take her eyes off me, and acted like Yumi and Goro weren't there at all, even when they tried to talk to her. As we shuffled into the theatre, Kyoko made sure that Goro didn't sit next to me, and that she did. This was just too weird. It was clear that Kyoko had set this whole thing up, and got Goro to ask me along with them. I guess little Goro took over the thinking for a while, and he just went along with the plans in hopes of getting laid. During the trailers for the movie, I gave Yumi a nudge, and we both uncomfortably made our getaway before Kyoko could ask any questions. This was just the tip of the iceberg. For the next week, Yumi kept telling me that she had seen Kyoko following her around town, glaring at her with hatred in her eyes. Honestly, I was worried that Yumi might leave me, simply because she was scared of Kyoko's obsession. I suppose that was Kyoko's plan. This whole thing came to a climax on one weekend night. Yumi and I had been out for a few drinks, and came back to my place to spend the night. I put the key in the lock to open the front door to my apartment, but I needn't have bothered. The door just swung open. I'd forgotten to lock the bloody thing before setting out. That was so unlike me. Thankfully, nothing was missing or out of place, and I just cursed my stupidity. We stayed up pretty late that night, fooling around, and before sleeping, Yumi went upstairs to use the bathroom. In the meantime, I laid my head on the pillow to rest my eyes. Then, the sound of footsteps entered the dark bedroom. That was quick, I thought to myself, too tired to open my eyes. I waited for Yumi to hop into bed beside me. But she didn't. She just stood there, breathing heavily. "Yumi? What are you doing, baby?" I whispered tiredly. Then, in a soft reply,
It's Kyoko.
my muscles locked up. With a racing heart, I opened my eyes to see a silhouette at the foot of my bed. I couldn't make out many details.
Are you awake?
Yeah, no fucking shit I am. What the hell are you playing at? How the hell did you get in here?
The landlady let me in. I've been waiting for you to get back.
She flicked the light switch on the wall behind her, and the room lit up. I could see Kyoko now, there in a thin nightgown, like she was ready for bed. What made my stomach churn, though, was the thing in her right hand. It was a knife. What the fuck is this? Get the hell out before I call the cops!
Shh.
Kyoko continued to take unnecessarily deep breaths, like she was gasping for air or something.
Why do you keep ignoring me, Shin?
I haven't been ignoring you. Just put down the knife and tell me what this is all about, huh?
It's about this. Why do you always act so weird around me? It's like you never want me around. I don't get it. I show you nothing but love, and get this in return?
This girl was living on another planet. It's like she really thought we were in a relationship because of that 3-minute date we had, and she thought I was cheating on her or something. This was a total shock to my system, and I was struggling to process what was actually happening. It was like I had woken up